Carl Jung explained, 12 spiritual signals. You're starting to detach from earthly attachments. The gravity of attachment, how sweetly it pulls us into its orbit, how gently it convinces us that our chains are made of gold. In the beginning, before consciousness awakens to its deeper currents, we mistake bondage for beauty, imprisonment for investment. We gather around ourselves the glittering artifacts of existence, possessions that promise permanence, relationships that vow eternal security, identities that offer the illusion of solid ground beneath our feet. Yet beneath this surface dance of accumulation lies a truth that Jung understood with crystalline clarity. Attachment is the ego's desperate attempt to create islands of certainty in an ocean of impermanence. Consider the nature of this gravitational pull. Like planets drawn into orbit around a star, we circle endlessly around the objects of our attachment, never recognizing that we have become satellites to our own desires. The career we've built becomes not just what we do, but who we are. The relationship we've cultivated transforms from a dance of two souls into a definition of our worth. The possessions we've gathered cease to be mere objects and become extensions of our identity, mirrors in which we seek to glimpse our own reflection. This is the exquisite trap of the human condition, that in seeking security, we create the very insecurity we hoped to avoid. For attachment, by its very nature, carries within it the seed of loss. Everything we cling to exists in the realm of form, and all forms are subject to the inexorable law of change. The house we call home will one day crumble. The body we identify with will age and return to dust. The relationships we depend upon for our sense of self will shift and evolve, sometimes beyond recognition. Yet there is a sacred paradox hidden within this apparent tragedy. The tighter we grasp, the more likely we are to crush what we hold dear. The more desperately we cling to our securities, the more insecure we become. It is like trying to cup water in our hands. The harder we squeeze, the faster it flows through our fingers. Jung recognized this fundamental principle of the psyche. That which we resist persists, and that which we grasp too tightly inevitably slips away. But why do we attach in the first place? What drives this compulsive need to bind ourselves to the forms of the world? At its root, attachment springs from a profound case of mistaken identity. We have forgotten our true nature, that vast, spacious awareness that exists prior to all form, and have instead identified ourselves with the temporary costumes we wear in the theater of existence. The ego, that necessary but limited aspect of consciousness, mistakes itself for the whole of who we are. The ego is like an actor who has forgotten they are playing a role, who has become so absorbed in their character that they believe the costume is their skin, the script is their authentic voice, the stage is the entire universe. From this contracted perspective, the ego naturally seeks to solidify its position, to gather evidence of its reality, to accumulate proof of its worth. It collects experiences like trophies, relationships like insurance policies, achievements like fortifications against the void. This is not to suggest that the ego is evil or that attachment is inherently wrong. Both serve important functions in the human journey. The ego allows us to navigate the practical demands of existence, to form relationships, to create and achieve and contribute to the world. Attachment can be the glue that holds communities together, the bond that nurtures love between souls, the motivation that drives us to care for what matters. The problem arises not from attachment itself, but from unconscious attachment, from the compulsive, unexamined clinging that arises when we mistake the temporary for the eternal. Jung understood that true freedom comes not from the absence of attachment, but from conscious relationship with it. This is the difference between being a slave to our desires and being a gardener of our soul. The slave is driven by unconscious compulsions, always seeking the next acquisition to fill the endless hunger within. The gardener tends their inner landscape with awareness, choosing what to cultivate and what to release, based on wisdom rather than craving. The gravitational field of attachment operates through many subtle mechanisms. There is the attachment to comfort, which keeps us imprisoned in the familiar, even when it no longer serves our growth. There is the attachment to being right, which prevents us from learning and evolving. There is the attachment to our story about ourselves, which becomes a cage of self-imposed limitations. There is the attachment to how others see us, which turns us into prisoners of public opinion. Each of these attachments creates what Jung might call a complex, an autonomous cluster of energy that operates below the threshold of consciousness, pulling our strings like a hidden puppeteer. The attachment to success drives us to sacrifice our health and relationships on the altar of achievement. The attachment to being loved compels us to contort ourselves into shapes that please others while abandoning our authentic nature. The attachment to being safe keeps us locked in towers of our own construction, protected perhaps, but also isolated from the very life we seek to preserve. Yet within the gravitational field of attachment lies a profound teaching. Like a Zen master's riddle, attachment points us toward its own transcendence. Every time we suffer from loss, from the gap between expectation and reality, from the inevitable disappointment that comes when external circumstances fail to provide lasting fulfillment, we are being invited to look deeper. The pain of attachment is not a punishment but a pointer, not a curse but a curriculum designed to awaken us to our true nature. This awakening does not happen through force or willpower. We cannot simply decide to stop being attached, any more than we can decide to stop being human. The loosening of attachment is more like the melting of ice in spring, a natural process that occurs when the conditions are right, when the warmth of awareness penetrates the frozen patterns of unconscious clinging. This warmth comes not from rejection of our attachments, but from intimate relationship with them, from the kind of loving attention that transforms everything it touches. The process begins with recognition. We must first see our golden chains as chains, must recognize the subtle ways we have bound ourselves to outcomes, identities, and possessions. This seeing is not judgmental but compassionate, like a parent watching a child play with toys, understanding that this play serves an important purpose, even while knowing it is not the whole of reality. As awareness illuminates our patterns of attachment, something miraculous begins to occur. The grip naturally loosens, not through effort but through understanding. We begin to sense the difference between loving someone and being attached to them, between enjoying our possessions and being possessed by them, between playing our roles skillfully and being trapped in them unconsciously. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the emergence of a third way that transcends the old dualities of either clinging desperately or rejecting completely. In this spaciousness, a new kind of relationship with life becomes possible. We can hold our possessions lightly, like flowers in our palm, appreciating their beauty while accepting their temporary nature. We can love deeply without demanding guarantees, can invest ourselves fully while remaining free. This is the art of what Buddhists call non-attachment, not the absence of caring, but caring without clinging, loving without owning, engaging without being enslaved. The journey from attachment to freedom is not a straight path, but a spiral dance, returning again and again to the same themes at deeper levels of understanding. We may think we have transcended our need for approval, only to discover subtle ways we still seek validation. We may believe we have released our attachment to success, only to find we have become attached to being detached. This is natural and necessary. Consciousness evolves through these recursive patterns, each revolution bringing greater awareness and integration. The golden chains that once bound us do not simply disappear but are transformed into golden light. The very energy that was locked in attachment becomes available for authentic creativity, genuine service, and deeper love. What we once hoarded, we begin to share. What we once grasped, we learn to offer. What we once used to fill the void within, we recognize as expressions of the fullness that was already here. This transformation is not about renouncing the world, but about finding our proper relationship to it. We are not meant to live as hermits, avoiding all engagement with the material realm. Rather, we are called to participate fully while remaining rooted in our essential nature, to dance in the world of form while never forgetting the formless awareness that is our true ground. This is the middle way, the narrow gate, the razor's edge between attachment and aversion, between engagement and imprisonment. Jung recognized that this process of loosening attachment is fundamentally an alchemical transformation. What the ego experiences as loss, the soul recognizes as liberation. What feels like death to our old way of being is actually birth into a larger life. The gravitational pull of attachment, which once seemed like an inescapable force, reveals itself to be the very energy that can lift us into orbit around our authentic self. In the end, we discover that true security lies not in what we can accumulate or control, but in our capacity to remain present and aware, regardless of external circumstances. The golden chains that once seemed so precious become transparent, and we realize we were never truly bound except by our own misunderstanding. Freedom was always our birthright, we simply forgot to claim it. In remembering, in loosening our grip on the temporary, we open our hands to receive the eternal gift of life itself, not as something to be possessed, but as the very essence of what we are. The summit calls to us with such promise, yet when we finally arrive, breathless and triumphant, we find ourselves surrounded not by the golden light we expected, but by a strange gray fog that muffles all celebration. This is the peculiar alchemy of worldly success, how it transforms in our mouths the moment we taste it, how the nectar we pursued with such fervor suddenly turns to ash on our tongue. It is not that we have failed, quite the opposite. We have succeeded magnificently, checked every box, climbed every rung, accumulated every symbol that society promised would deliver fulfillment. Yet here, at the pinnacle of our earthly achievements, we encounter the most bewildering discovery. The cup we thought was full reveals itself to have no bottom at all. Jung understood this phenomenon with the precision of a master cartographer, mapping the territories of the soul. He recognized that what we call the midlife crisis is actually a spiritual emergency, not a breakdown but a breakthrough, not a failure of character but a success of consciousness. The ego, having accomplished its appointed tasks, having proven its worth in the marketplace of the world, suddenly finds itself face to face with its own limitations, like a skilled actor who has mastered their role only to realize they are trapped within it. The ego begins to sense that all its achievements are costume jewelry adorning a much deeper, more mysterious identity. This realization rarely arrives with fanfare. More often it seeps in like water through the cracks of our carefully constructed life, beginning as a whisper of dissatisfaction that grows steadily louder until it becomes impossible to ignore. The corner office that once symbolized victory now feels like a gilded cage. The bank account that promised security becomes merely numbers on a screen. The social status we worked so hard to attain feels as insubstantial as morning mist. We look around at the life we have built with such dedication and ask the question that terrifies the ego: Is this all there is? The taste of ash in the mouth of success is perhaps life's most generous teaching, though few recognize it as such in the moment. We are conditioned to interpret this disillusionment as evidence that we have chosen wrongly, that we need different goals, better strategies, more impressive achievements. The ego's first response is always to double down, to seek more of what has already proven insufficient. If this promotion doesn't satisfy, perhaps the next one will. If this relationship doesn't complete us, maybe the next person will be our missing piece. If this house doesn't provide lasting contentment, surely a bigger one will fill the void. But the void is not seeking to be filled, it is seeking to be recognized. What we experience as emptiness is actually spaciousness. What feels like lack is actually fullness that has not yet been discovered. The ash taste of worldly success is not life's way of punishing us for our ambitions, but its way of awakening us to the fact that we have been drinking from streams that cannot ultimately quench our deepest thirst. We are being invited to discover the well within ourselves, the source that never runs dry because it was never separate from what we are. This invitation often feels like a betrayal. We had an implicit contract with the world. Work hard, play by the rules, accumulate the right symbols, and happiness would be our reward. Now, having fulfilled our part of the bargain, we discover that the world cannot deliver what it promised. Not because the world is malicious, but because the world of form is simply incapable of satisfying the formless longing within us. We are asking the finite to provide what only the infinite can give, expecting the temporary to deliver what only the eternal can offer. The recognition that our achievements taste like ash is the beginning of what alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the dark night of the soul where all our old certainties dissolve. This is not a comfortable process. The ego, having invested so much of its identity in its accomplishments, experiences this revelation as a kind of death. Everything it has worked for, everything it has built its sense of self upon, suddenly seems meaningless. The very foundations of reality appear to shift beneath our feet, leaving us standing in what feels like a wasteland of our own making. Yet within this apparent wasteland lie the seeds of a profound transformation. Jung called this the enantiodromia, the tendency of any psychological extreme to eventually transform into its opposite. The same drive that once propelled us toward external achievement begins to turn inward, seeking not conquest but understanding, not accumulation but integration. The energy that was once focused on impressing others becomes available for discovering ourselves. The ambition that once sought to prove our worth to the world transforms into a quest to uncover our true nature. This turning inward is not always immediate or obvious. Often we spend considerable time and energy trying to restore the old magic, to make our achievements matter again, to recapture the enthusiasm that once drove us forward. We may change careers, end relationships, move to new cities, acquire different possessions, anything to escape the growing sense that we have been chasing mirages in a desert of our own creation. But like a hound following a scent, the soul is relentless in its pursuit of authenticity. No external rearrangement can ultimately satisfy the inner calling for truth. The taste of ash serves another crucial function. It burns away our illusions about what we thought we needed to be happy. Layer by layer, like old paint being stripped from a piece of furniture, our false dependencies are revealed and released. We discover that we don't need others' approval as much as we thought. We realize that our happiness doesn't actually depend on our net worth or our professional status. We begin to sense that our deepest joy comes not from getting what we want, but from wanting what we have, from appreciating the simple miracle of being alive in this moment. This stripping away can feel like a kind of spiritual poverty, but it is actually the beginning of true wealth. Like a tree that must lose its leaves to reveal its essential structure, we must release our attachments to external validation to discover our inherent worth. The ash taste of success teaches us discernment, the ability to distinguish between what genuinely nourishes our soul and what merely feeds our ego's appetite for more. As this discernment develops, we begin to notice subtle changes in how we approach life. The frantic pace of achievement begins to slow. The compulsive need to constantly improve our circumstances relaxes. We find ourselves drawn to simpler pleasures, a sunset, a conversation with a friend, the feeling of breathing deeply. These moments, which we might once have dismissed as insignificant, begin to reveal depths we never noticed before. We discover that the ordinary world, when approached with presence and awareness, contains all the magic we were seeking in our extraordinary accomplishments. This is not to say that achievement becomes meaningless or that ambition is inherently wrong. Rather, we begin to engage with these things from a different center of gravity. Instead of achieving in order to prove our worth, we create and accomplish as expressions of our inherent worth. Instead of seeking success to fill an inner void, we offer our gifts from a sense of inner fullness. The same activities that once felt compulsive and anxiety-provoking begin to feel playful and organic. Jung recognized that this transformation often requires what he called a sacrifice, not the giving up of external things, but the releasing of our unconscious identification with them. We sacrifice the story that we are only as valuable as our achievements. We release the belief that our happiness depends on external circumstances. We let go of the need to control outcomes and learn to trust the deeper intelligence that guides our lives. This sacrifice is rarely made all at once. More often, it happens in small increments, like water wearing away stone. Each moment we choose presence over productivity, being over doing, authenticity over appearance, we are making this sacred offering. Each time we resist the urge to measure our worth by external standards, we are participating in our own liberation. Each instance we find joy in the ordinary instead of constantly seeking the extraordinary, we are tasting the nectar that no worldly achievement can provide. The fog that surrounds the summit of success is not an obstacle to be overcome, but a teacher to be welcomed. It shows us that what we thought was the destination was actually just another stop on a much longer journey. The real summit, the true achievement, is not something we climb toward, but something we fall into. The recognition of our essential nature, the discovery of the self that was never absent, but only temporarily obscured by our fixation on becoming someone other than who we already are. As the fog lifts, and it does lift gradually through the patient practice of presence and the cultivation of inner awareness, we see the landscape with new eyes. The same world that once promised everything and delivered disappointment now reveals itself as a sacred playground, a divine theater where consciousness explores itself through infinite forms and experiences. Our achievements don't disappear, but they take their proper place as expressions of our creativity rather than definitions of our identity. The ash taste of success becomes paradoxically the most nourishing meal we have ever consumed, for it feeds not the ego's endless hunger, but the soul's deeper wisdom. It teaches us that true fulfillment comes not from getting what we think we want, but from recognizing what we already are. In learning to find the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the temporary, the infinite in the finite, we discover that we were never actually climbing toward anything at all. We were always already at the summit, always already home, always already whole. The journey was simply the long way around to realizing what was never absent, the love, the peace, the joy that are not achievements to be earned, but the very ground of our being. In the end, when success tastes like ash, we are being invited to Remember our true nature as the awareness in which all experiences arise and pass away. This awareness is not diminished by failure nor enlarged by success. It is the constant, the unchanging, the eternal witness to all the temporary dramas of achievement and loss. To rest in this awareness is to find the satisfaction that no worldly accomplishment can provide, the deep contentment of being fully present to what is, rather than constantly seeking to become something more. The sacred vestments we have worn for so long, the carefully crafted identities that once felt as essential as our own skin, begin to reveal themselves as costumes in a grand theatrical production. Parent, professional, partner, provider. These roles that once defined the very essence of who we believed ourselves to be now feel strangely loose, like clothes that no longer fit after a profound transformation of the body beneath. This is not a crisis of identity, but an expansion of it. Not a loss of self, but a discovery of the self that exists beyond all the masks we wear in the theater of daily existence. Jung understood this loosening as one of the most crucial passages in the individuation process, the journey towards psychological wholeness. He recognized that we must first fully inhabit our roles before we can transcend them, must master the art of being someone before we can discover what it means to simply be. The roles themselves are not the problem. They are necessary stations on the path to self-realization. The difficulty arises when we mistake these temporary costumes for our eternal identity, when we believe that who we are is exhausted by what we do. The parent who has defined themselves entirely through their children's achievements suddenly faces an empty nest and asks, "Who am I when I am no longer needed in this way?" The executive who has poured their life force into corporate success reaches retirement and wonders, "What is my value when I no longer hold this position?" The spouse who has existed primarily as half of a couple confronts the possibility of being alone and questions, "Do I exist independently of this relationship?" These are not merely practical concerns, but spiritual inquiries, doorways through which we are invited to explore the vast landscape of our deeper being. The loosening begins subtly, like ice at the edge of a pond in early spring. We catch ourselves going through the motions of our familiar roles while sensing that something essential has shifted beneath the surface. The words we speak in our professional capacity feel foreign in our mouths. The automatic responses we give in our family relationships seem to echo from a distant chamber of our psyche. We find ourselves observing our own performance with a curious detachment, as if watching an actor on a stage, recognizing the skill of the performance while knowing it is not the entirety of who we are. This observer self, what Jung called the transcendent function, emerges naturally when consciousness expands beyond the narrow confines of role identification. It is not that we reject our roles or perform them poorly. Rather, we begin to hold them more lightly, to engage with them from a different center of gravity. The parent continues to love and guide their children, but no longer needs their children's success to validate their own worth. The professional continues to work skillfully, but finds their sense of identity rooted in something deeper than their job title. The partner continues to love and commit, but discovers a completeness within themselves that enriches rather than depends upon the relationship. This transformation can be deeply unsettling for those around us who have grown accustomed to our predictable patterns. Family members may feel confused when we no longer respond in our familiar ways. Colleagues might be puzzled by our decreased attachment to outcomes that once seemed to matter so much to us. Friends could feel threatened by our growing autonomy, especially if they have been accustomed to our dependence or our need for their approval. The world has invested in our old identity as much as we have, and our evolution necessarily disturbs the equilibrium of our relationships. Yet this disturbance is often exactly what is needed to create more authentic connections. When we stop performing our roles compulsively and begin to inhabit them consciously, we invite others into more genuine relationship with who we actually are rather than who we think we should be. The love that emerges from this authenticity is qualitatively different from the love that was based on role fulfillment. It is less demanding, more spacious, founded not on what we can provide for others, but on the recognition of our shared essential nature. The process of loosening from role identification often involves what feels like a death, the death of who we thought we were. This is why it can be so terrifying and why many people resist it with every fiber of their being. To release our grip on our carefully constructed identities feels like stepping into an abyss, like dissolving into nothingness. The ego, which has worked so hard to establish its position in the world, experiences this loosening as an existential threat. All its strategies for maintaining control seem to be slipping away. But what feels like death to the ego is actually birth to the soul. Like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, we must dissolve the old form to discover the new one that was always waiting within. The caterpillar does not simply add wings to its existing structure, it must literally liquefy, must surrender its caterpillar identity completely, trusting in an intelligence it cannot comprehend to guide its metamorphosis into something entirely different, yet somehow more true to its essential nature. This trust is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the process. We are being asked to release what we know for what we do not know, to trade the security of our familiar limitations for the uncertainty of our unlimited potential. The roles we have played have provided not just identity, but also instructions for how to navigate the world. Without them, we can feel like actors who have forgotten their lines, wandering on a stage with no script to follow. Yet in this apparent lostness lies the greatest gift of all, the opportunity to improvise from our authentic center rather than perform from memory. When we are no longer bound by the expectations of our roles, we can respond to each moment freshly, creatively, spontaneously. The parent can see their child not through the lens of parental duty, but with the eyes of wonder. The professional can engage their work not as a means to an end, but as a form of play. The partner can love not from need or obligation, but from the overflowing of their own fullness. Jung spoke of this as the emergence of the authentic self, not the small self that defines itself through roles and relationships, but the larger self that is the source from which all roles emerge. This self is like the space in which a play occurs, present in every scene, essential to every character, yet never limited by any particular performance. It is the awareness that remains constant while all identities shift and change, the eternal witness to the temporary dramas of personality. As we discover this space within ourselves, our relationship to our roles transforms completely. We no longer need them to tell us who we are, because we have found the source of identity that exists prior to all identification. We can step into any role that serves the moment, teacher, student, leader, follower, giver, receiver, without getting trapped in any of them. This is what Jung meant by psychological flexibility, the ability to respond appropriately to each situation without being rigidly defined by our responses. The loosening of identity is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process, a continuous releasing of old skins as we grow into new dimensions of ourselves. Each transition in life offers another opportunity to discover who we are beyond the roles we play. Each ending, whether it is the end of a career, a relationship, a phase of life, or simply the end of a day, invites us to remember the continuity that exists beneath all discontinuity, the being that persists through all becoming. In the deepest moments of this process, we may experience what mystics have called the dark night of the soul, a period when the old identity has dissolved, but the new one has not yet emerged. This liminal space can feel like a kind of purgatory, where we exist in suspension between who we were and who we are becoming. Nothing feels solid or certain. The future appears as a blank canvas, and we have forgotten how to paint. Yet this darkness is pregnant with possibility. Like the darkness of the womb or the darkness of the earth in winter, it is not empty but full of potential. In releasing our grip on our old identities, we create space for something new to emerge, not something we construct with our will, but something that arises naturally from the depths of our being, like a spring emerging from underground. The roles we once played do not disappear but are transformed. They become expressions of our creativity rather than definitions of our reality. The parent learns to love without attachment, supporting their children's growth while allowing them the freedom to become themselves. The professional discovers work as a form of service, contributing their gifts without needing recognition or reward. The partner experiences love as a celebration of unity rather than a strategy for avoiding loneliness. This transformation often brings with it a profound simplicity. When we are no longer performing elaborate roles designed to prove our worth or secure our position, we can engage with life directly, spontaneously, authentically. The complexity that once characterized our interactions with others gives way to a kind of transparency. We say what we mean, feel what we feel, respond from our center rather than from our conditioning. Others may find this simplicity disconcerting at first, especially if they have grown accustomed to our more complex, role-based interactions. But gradually, many will discover that they prefer this more authentic version of us. Our genuineness gives them permission to be more genuine themselves. Our freedom from role imprisonment invites them to examine their own identifications. Our peace with being nobody special inspires them to consider what it might feel like to stop trying to be somebody important. To rest in this awareness is to find the satisfaction that no worldly accomplishment can provide. The deep contentment of being fully present to what is, rather than constantly seeking to become something more. Like trees in autumn that release their leaves, not from poverty but from wisdom, we find ourselves naturally shedding the possessions that once seemed as essential as breath itself. The compulsion that once drove us through shopping centers and catalogs, the restless hunger that whispered we needed just one more thing to feel complete, begins to quiet into something approaching contentment. This is not the bitter renunciation of the ascetic, nor the forced poverty of the guilty rich, but something far more mysterious, a spontaneous recognition that we already have enough, that we have perhaps always had enough, and that our happiness was never actually dependent on acquiring more than we need. Jung understood this phenomenon as part of the natural intelligence of the psyche, the way consciousness naturally seeks balance when it has swung too far in any direction. After years or decades of accumulation of believing the cultural myth that more equals better, something within us begins to crave simplicity, the way a person lost in noise craves silence. The soul, having gorged itself on material acquisition, begins to hunger for space, physical space, mental space, emotional space, the kind of spaciousness that can only emerge when we stop filling every corner of our lives with things. This shift rarely announces itself with fanfare. More often, it begins as a subtle change in our relationship to shopping, a decreased enthusiasm for the acquisition that once provided such reliable pleasure. We walk through stores that once excited us and feel nothing but a vague weariness. The objects that once called to us with such magnetic appeal now seem to whisper from behind glass, "You don't really need me." The credit card in our wallet grows heavier, not with debt, but with the weight of recognition that we have been trying to purchase what cannot be bought, seeking through external acquisition what can only be found within. This is not deprivation, but discernment, not loss, but liberation. Like a master chef who learns to prepare increasingly refined dishes with fewer ingredients, we begin to discover the art of living richly with less. The cluttered surfaces of our homes start to clear as we release objects that served no purpose beyond filling space. The overflowing closets thin out as we realize how few clothes we actually need or wear. The shelves of books we meant to read someday find their way to others who will actually open them. Each release brings with it a curious lightness, as if we have been carrying invisible weights that we only notice when we set them down. The house that once felt too small because it couldn't contain all our possessions suddenly feels spacious and peaceful. The rooms that were once crowded with the evidence of our shopping reveal their natural beauty, their capacity to hold not just objects but breath, movement, silence. But this simplification goes deeper than mere decluttering. It represents a fundamental shift in how we understand abundance. The consumer culture that surrounds us has trained us to equate having with being, to measure our worth by our possessions, to find identity in the brands we wear and the objects we display. We have been taught that scarcity is our natural state, and that happiness requires the constant acquisition of more. More clothes, more gadgets, more experiences, more options, more of everything. Yet as we begin to release our grip on material accumulation, we discover something that the marketplace cannot sell us: the abundance that exists in appreciation, the wealth that comes from wanting what we already have. The simple meal becomes a feast when we taste it with full attention. The clothes we already own feel luxurious when we wear them with gratitude, rather than the sense that we are making do. The space we inhabit reveals its beauty when we stop seeing it through the lens of what it lacks, and start seeing it for what it contains. This transformation in perception is perhaps the deepest aspect of material simplicity. We begin to see through the eyes of sufficiency rather than scarcity, where once we noticed what was missing from every scene: the better car our neighbor drives, the nicer furniture in the magazine, the upgraded version of everything we own. Now we begin to notice what is present: the morning light streaming through our ordinary windows, the comfort of our familiar chair, the way our simple possessions hold the history of our lives within their worn surfaces. Jung would recognize this as a healing of the relationship between ego and self. The ego, in its fear and insecurity, constantly seeks to accumulate evidence of its worth, to build barriers against uncertainty, to create a fortress of possessions that will somehow guarantee its safety. But the self knows that true security cannot be purchased, that real abundance is our natural state, that we are already whole and need nothing external to complete us. As this recognition deepens, our relationship to money itself begins to transform. The anxious hoarding that comes from a sense of scarcity gives way to a more fluid relationship with resources. Money becomes a tool for supporting what we value rather than a measure of our worth. We find ourselves spending less but enjoying it more, choosing quality over quantity, investing in experiences that nourish our souls rather than objects that merely occupy our space. This shift often mystifies our friends and family members who have grown accustomed to our previous patterns of consumption. They may worry that we are becoming depressed or depriving ourselves of life's pleasures. They cannot understand why we no longer seem excited by the sales and opportunities that once animated us. Some may feel threatened by our contentment, especially if their own happiness is still tied to acquisition, because our peace with having less challenges their belief that they need more. Yet for us, this simplification feels like coming home to ourselves. We discover pleasures we had forgotten in our rush to accumulate, the satisfaction of using something until it is truly worn out, the joy of empty surfaces, the peace that comes from owning only what serves our actual life rather than our imagined life. We find that with fewer possessions demanding our attention, we have more attention available for the people and experiences that truly matter. The art of having less reveals itself to be the art of having more time, because we spend less energy managing our belongings, more space because we are not crowded by objects we don't need, more freedom because we are not enslaved to the maintenance and protection of excessive possessions. The fear that simplicity would make our lives smaller dissolves as we discover that it actually makes them larger, more spacious, more filled with what we actually care about. This process of simplification often happens in waves, each wave carrying away another layer of unnecessary accumulation. We might spend months releasing clothes we never wear, then find ourselves drawn to simplify our kitchen, then our entertainment, then our commitments. Each area of our lives becomes a laboratory for discovering how little we actually need to feel completely satisfied. The wisdom traditions have long taught that attachment to possessions is one of the primary sources of suffering. But this teaching can seem harsh or unrealistic to those caught in the grip of consumer culture. What we discover through the natural process of simplification is that this teaching is not a moral judgment but a practical observation. The more we own, the more we must protect, maintain, organize, ensure, worry about. Each possession, no matter how beautiful or useful, makes a small claim on our attention and energy. As we learn to live with less, we discover the profound freedom that comes from needing less. The power that objects once held over us, the way they could make us feel inadequate or superior, anxious or satisfied, begins to dissipate. We stop being owned by our possessions and start simply owning them, lightly, temporarily, without the desperate grip of someone who believes their happiness depends on keeping everything they have ever acquired. This material simplicity opens doorways to other forms of abundance that cannot be purchased. We have more time for contemplation, more energy for relationships, more space for creativity. The silence that fills the spaces between our remaining possessions becomes not emptiness but fullness, the fullness of potential, of breath, of being. We discover that we have been living in a museum of our own making, and that by releasing most of the exhibits, we have created space for life itself to be the art. In the end, the art of having less teaches us the difference between wants and needs, between desires and requirements, between the endless hunger of the ego and the natural satisfaction of the soul. We learn that enough is a decision, not a circumstance, and that abundance is an inner state that no external acquisition can create or destroy. In choosing simplicity, we choose freedom, the freedom to be present, to be grateful, to be content with the miracle of existence itself, unadorned by the things we once thought we needed to make it complete. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the elaborate architecture of safety we have spent lifetimes constructing begins to reveal itself as nothing more than gossamer threads catching morning light. The insurance policies stacked like protective prayers in our filing cabinets, the emergency funds growing like hoarded grain in digital vaults, the contingency plans mapped out with the precision of military campaigns. All of these suddenly appear as what they have always been. Beautiful, intricate webs spun by a consciousness desperate to believe it can control the uncontrollable. This is perhaps the most vertiginous moment in the great dissolving, for it strikes at the very heart of what the ego believes itself to be, the architect of safety, the master of circumstances, the one who can outwit uncertainty through careful preparation and strategic thinking. The phantom of security is not easily released, for it has been our most trusted companion, the invisible hand that guided our choices, the voice that whispered in our ear that if we just planned enough, saved enough, prepared enough, we could somehow insulate ourselves from the fundamental uncertainty that pulses at the heart of existence. Jung understood this terror intimately, for he had walked through his own dark night of seeming dissolution, where all the structures that had once felt solid, his career, his reputation, his understanding of reality itself, began to shift like sand beneath his feet. In those years of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, he discovered that what we call security is often nothing more than a collective agreement to pretend that the ground beneath us is more solid than it actually is. The ego, in its magnificent complexity, creates layers upon layers of protection. It purchases life insurance as if it could somehow insure life itself against its own impermanence. It builds savings accounts like fortresses against an uncertain future, not recognizing that the future, by its very nature, refuses to be purchased or controlled. It crafts backup plans for the backup plans, creating elaborate decision trees that branch out like neural networks, each pathway mapped and calculated, each possibility anticipated and prepared for. But there is something almost poetic in the way these constructions begin to lose their power over us. Like morning mist that seems so substantial in the dawn light, but dissolves the moment the sun truly rises, our security systems begin to reveal their ephemeral nature. This is not a failure of planning or preparation. It is an awakening to the deeper truth that no amount of external arrangement can create the kind of safety the soul actually seeks. The process often begins subtly, with small cracks in our certainty. The retirement account that was supposed to guarantee a comfortable future fluctuates wildly with market forces beyond our control. The health insurance that promised protection becomes a labyrinth of bureaucracy when we need it most. The stable job that felt like bedrock suddenly shifts with corporate restructuring, technological change, or economic turbulence that no amount of personal planning could have anticipated. At first, the ego responds to these cracks by doubling down, by seeking even more elaborate forms of security. If one investment strategy fails, surely a more diversified portfolio will work. If one insurance policy isn't enough, perhaps multiple policies will provide the desired protection. If one backup plan proves insufficient, surely 3 or 4 will cover all contingencies. But gradually, as life continues to demonstrate its fundamental unpredictability, something deeper begins to shift. This shift is what the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the stage where everything we have built must be dissolved before something new can emerge. In the realm of security and control, the nigredo manifests as the dawning recognition that all our careful constructions are built on foundations we never actually controlled in the first place. The economy, the weather, the health of our bodies, the stability of our relationships, the continuation of technological systems we depend upon. All of these exist in a web of interdependence so complex and dynamic that the idea of controlling them begins to seem not just impossible, but almost absurdly naive. Yet this recognition, terrifying as it is to the ego, carries within it the seeds of a profound liberation. For what is being dissolved is not our actual well-being, but only our anxious attachment to the illusion that well-being can be guaranteed through external arrangements. The phantom of security dies so that real security, the kind that comes from within, that cannot be lost or stolen or devalued by market forces, can finally be born. Jung spoke of this transition as the movement from ego consciousness to self-consciousness, from identification with the small self that believes it must control everything, to recognition of the larger self that is already whole, already complete, already secure in a way that no external arrangement could ever provide. This is not a passive fatalism or a reckless abandonment of reasonable precaution. It is rather a shift in the locus of security, from external to internal, from contingent to essential, from fabricated to discovered. The soul that has touched this deeper ground of being begins to relate to practical security measures with a different quality of consciousness. Plans are still made, but they are held lightly, like tools rather than identity. Savings are still accumulated, but they no longer carry the weight of our entire emotional well-being. Insurance is still purchased, but it is understood for what it actually is: a reasonable hedge against certain possibilities, not a guarantee against the fundamental uncertainty of existence. This transformation often precipitates what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite. The desperate search for security becomes the very source of insecurity, as we realize how much energy we have invested in trying to control what cannot be controlled. The attachment to safety becomes itself the greatest danger, for it keeps us in a state of chronic anxiety about all the threats we cannot eliminate. The pursuit of certainty becomes the path to recognizing the beauty and vitality that can only emerge from embracing uncertainty. In the depths of this recognition, we begin to discover what the mystics have always known: that there is indeed a kind of security available to human consciousness, but it is not the kind that can be purchased or planned or guaranteed through external means. It is the security of the ground of being itself, the unchanging awareness that witnesses all change, the eternal presence that remains constant through all temporal fluctuations. This deeper security does not depend on circumstances aligning in our favor. It does not require the stock market to behave predictably, or the weather to cooperate with our plans, or our bodies to remain forever young and healthy. It is the security of knowing oneself as consciousness itself, as the aware presence in which all experiences arise and pass away, as the unshakable witness to the dance of impermanence. The ego, confronted with this possibility, often experiences what can only be called existential vertigo. For if security does not come from external arrangements, then what has all this striving been for? If the foundation of well-being lies not in what we can accumulate or control, but in what we already are, then what becomes of all our careful planning and worried preparation? This is the moment when the phantom of security reveals its true nature. It has never been about actual safety. It has been about the ego's need to feel important, to maintain the illusion that it is the captain of its ship, the master of its fate. The elaborate security systems we construct are often less about protecting ourselves from genuine dangers and more about maintaining the ego's sense of agency and control in a universe that operates according to laws and patterns far grander than any individual consciousness could hope to direct. But as this phantom dissolves, something remarkable begins to emerge in its place. We discover that we can navigate uncertainty with grace. We find that we can face the unknown with curiosity rather than terror. We learn that our deepest well-being does not depend on outcomes being predictable or circumstances being controllable, but on our capacity to remain present and responsive to whatever actually arises. This is not a state of passive resignation, but rather a kind of dynamic equilibrium with the forces of existence. We continue to make reasonable preparations for anticipated needs. We continue to take sensible precautions against probable risks, but we do so from a place of practical wisdom rather than anxious attachment, from a foundation of inner stability rather than external desperation. The transformation manifests in countless small ways. The emergency fund remains, but it no longer generates the chronic anxiety about whether it is large enough. The insurance policies stay in place, but they no longer carry the psychological weight of our entire sense of safety. The backup plans are still made, but they are held with the lightness of someone who knows that the most important resource for navigating uncertainty cannot be planned or purchased. It can only be cultivated from within. This cultivation is the real work of spiritual maturation. It is the gradual recognition that consciousness itself is the ultimate security, that awareness itself is the unshakable ground, that presence itself is the only reliable constant in a universe of constant change. This is not a philosophical abstraction, but a lived reality that can be discovered through the patient practice of turning attention inward, of learning to rest in the aware space that witnesses all experience without being disturbed by any of it. Jung called this process individuation, the movement towards psychological wholeness that involves integrating all aspects of the psyche, including the shadow of our need for control. The individuated consciousness does not eliminate the practical ego functions that help us navigate the relative world, but it no longer identifies with them exclusively. It recognizes itself as something larger and more fundamental than the sum of its strategies and preparations. In this recognition, the relationship to uncertainty undergoes a complete transformation. What once felt like a threat to be defended against begins to feel like the very condition that allows for creativity, growth, and genuine surprise. The unknown, which the ego experienced as fundamentally hostile, reveals itself as the fertile darkness from which all new possibilities emerge. This shift often coincides with a deepening trust in what religious traditions call providence, what Jung termed the self, what Eastern traditions recognize as the Tao, the underlying intelligence and benevolence of existence itself. This is not a naive optimism that believes everything will always work out according to our preferences, but rather a mature recognition that there is a deeper wisdom at work in the unfolding of events than our limited consciousness can comprehend or control. The soul that has touched this deeper wisdom begins to relate to life's uncertainties as a participation in a vast creative process rather than as problems to be solved or threats to be neutralized. Challenges are met with curiosity about what they might be asking of us, rather than panic about how to eliminate them. Changes are experienced as invitations to grow rather than evidence that our security systems have failed. This does not mean becoming reckless or abandoning all practical preparation. The mature soul continues to engage with the relative world with intelligence and care, but it does so from a foundation of inner stability that does not depend on external outcomes. It prepares for probable scenarios while remaining open to improbable ones. It makes plans while holding them lightly. It builds structures while remembering that all structures are impermanent. The phantom of security in its dissolution reveals that what we truly seek is not the elimination of uncertainty, but the capacity to dance with uncertainty gracefully. We discover that the security we actually need is not the security of guaranteed outcomes, but the security of knowing that we can meet whatever comes with presence, wisdom, and an open heart. This realization often brings with it a sense of tremendous relief, as if a burden we did not know we were carrying has suddenly been lifted. The chronic tension of trying to control the uncontrollable begins to relax. The perpetual anxiety about all the things that could go wrong starts to dissolve. In its place emerges a quality of trust that is not based on external assurances, but on the direct recognition of our own essential unshakability. Jung understood that this transformation could not be forced or hurried, that it emerges naturally as consciousness matures and begins to recognize its own deeper nature. He saw that the dissolution of our attachments to security is not a loss, but a liberation, not a diminishment, but an expansion. not a weakness, but the discovery of a strength that no external circumstances can disturb. In the end, the phantom of security dissolves not because we learn to live without safety, but because we discover where safety actually lies. It is not in our bank accounts or our insurance policies or our contingency plans, though all of these may have their place in a well-lived life. It is in the recognition of what we truly are beneath all the roles and strategies and identities we have constructed, the unchanging awareness in which all experience appears, the eternal presence that remains untouched by time, the unshakable ground of being that needs no external support, because it is itself the foundation upon which all else rests. This ground is not something we need to create or achieve or purchase. It is what we already are, what we have always been, what we could never actually lose, no matter what circumstances might arise. The phantom of security dissolves because we remember that we are the security we have been seeking, not as ego but as consciousness itself, not as the small self that worries and plans, but as the vast self that encompasses and transcends all conditions. And in this remembering, the soul finds itself at home in uncertainty, comfortable with the unknown, at peace with the impermanent nature of all external conditions, for it has discovered the one thing that cannot change, cannot be lost, cannot be threatened by any circumstance, the aware presence that we are, the conscious space in which all of life's experiences arise and dissolve like waves on the ocean of being. This is the real security, the only security, the security that allows us to engage fully with life's uncertainties, not because we have eliminated risk, but because we have found the unshakable ground from which all risks can be met with wisdom, courage, and an open heart. The phantom of security dissolves, and what remains is security itself, not as something we possess, but as something we are. In the deepening silence of the soul's return to itself, there comes a moment when the voices that once commanded our attention with the authority of absolute truth begin to fade like distant radio signals losing their frequency. The opinions of others, those judgments, assessments, and evaluations that once shaped our every gesture, colored our every choice, and determined our sense of worth, gradually lose their hypnotic power over the landscape of consciousness. This withering is not born of callousness or indifference, not from a hardening of the heart or a withdrawal from human connection. Rather, it emerges from something far more profound, the slow recognition that the mirror we have been holding up to catch the reflection of others' approval was always showing us a distorted image, never the truth of what we actually are. Jung understood this transformation as perhaps the most essential movement in the process of individuation, the gradual shift from living according to external expectations to living from the authentic center of one's being. He saw that the majority of human suffering stems from this fundamental misdirection of attention, this persistent looking outward for validation that can only truly come from within. The ego, in its earliest formations, learns to navigate the world through the careful reading of others' responses. The child watches the parent's face for signs of approval or disapproval, learns to modulate behavior according to the reactions it generates, begins to construct an identity based on the feedback received from the surrounding world. This is natural, necessary, even beautiful in its own way. The young consciousness learning to dance with the social fabric that will support and contain it. But somewhere in this process, a subtle substitution occurs. The external feedback, which was meant to be information about how to move harmoniously within relationship, becomes the primary source of self-knowledge. The opinions of others, which were meant to provide guidance for social navigation, become the arbiters of personal worth. The approval of the collective, which was meant to offer a sense of belonging, becomes the foundation upon which the entire structure of identity is built. And so the soul finds itself trapped in what can only be called a hall of mirrors, constantly seeking its own reflection in the eyes, words, and responses of others. Every interaction becomes an occasion for evaluation. Every conversation carries the subtext of judgment. Every relationship transforms into a courtroom where the self stands perpetually on trial, awaiting the verdict that will determine its value. This is the great exhaustion that precedes the withering, the bone-deep tiredness that comes from a lifetime of performing for an audience that can never be fully satisfied, never be permanently pleased, never offer the unconditional acceptance that the soul actually seeks. For the fundamental tragedy of seeking validation from others is not that they are unwilling to give it, but that even when they do, it never quite reaches the place in us that most needs to be seen and affirmed. The process of withering often begins with small moments of recognition. Perhaps it is the realization that the person whose opinion we most value is themselves desperately seeking the approval of someone else, creating an endless chain of external reference with no solid ground anywhere. Perhaps it is the discovery that the same action can be praised by one person and criticized by another, sometimes even by the same person on different days, revealing the arbitrary and changeable nature of human judgment. Or perhaps it begins with the quiet observation that the internal commentary about others' opinions, the constant mental rehearsal of what they might think, the elaborate anticipation of their possible responses, the careful crafting of words and actions to generate the desired reaction, has become a kind of tyranny, a prison of the mind that consumes enormous amounts of energy while producing very little authentic connection or genuine satisfaction. As these recognitions accumulate, something begins to shift in the very foundation of consciousness. The attention that was once scattered across dozens of potential judges begins to gather itself, to turn inward, to discover the possibility of an internal reference point that is not subject to the fluctuations of external opinion. This is not a sudden event, but a gradual unfolding, like the slow emergence of dawn that makes the artificial lights of night seem less necessary. Jung called this emerging internal reference point the self. Not the small ego self that seeks approval, but the larger self that encompasses and transcends the personality, the archetypal center of wholeness that needs no external validation because it is itself the source of value. The self does not seek approval because it is not separate from the source of worth. It does not need others' opinions because it has direct access to a deeper knowing that operates beyond the realm of judgment altogether. This discovery often precipitates a period that can feel like social isolation, though it is really the opposite. For what is being isolated is not the authentic self from genuine relationship, but the false self from the addictive patterns of seeking validation. The soul that has begun to find its own center often experiences a kind of withdrawal from the social games of approval seeking, not because it has lost interest in others, but because it has found something more reliable and satisfying than their fluctuating opinions. This withdrawal can be misunderstood by those who are still caught in the validation matrix. To them, the individuating soul might appear to have become selfish, arrogant, or indifferent. They may interpret the cessation of people-pleasing as a lack of care, the end of approval-seeking as the beginning of antisocial behavior, but from the inside, the experience is quite different. It is not a hardening, but a softening, not a withdrawal, but a deepening, not indifference, but the emergence of a more authentic form of caring. For when we are no longer driven by the need for others' approval, we become free to actually see them as they are rather than as potential sources of validation or threat. When we are not constantly calculating how to please them, we can listen to them more fully. When we are not performing for their benefit, we can offer them our genuine presence. The withering of the need for opinion creates space for something far more valuable, authentic relationship based on mutual recognition rather than mutual exploitation. Jung understood that this transformation is not about becoming immune to feedback or indifferent to the impact we have on others. The individuated consciousness remains sensitive to social dynamics, continues to care about the well-being of others, and maintains the capacity for empathy and compassion. But it no longer mistakes others' opinions for the truth about itself. It no longer seeks external validation as the primary source of self-worth. It no longer organizes its choices around the anticipated reactions of an imaginary audience. Instead, it learns to distinguish between useful feedback and mere opinion, between genuine care and casual judgment, between constructive criticism and the projections of others' unresolved material. It develops what might be called discernment, the ability to receive what is valuable in others' responses, while not being destabilized by their limitations, biases, or unconscious material. This discernment is itself a form of maturation, a sign that consciousness has developed its own internal compass, like a master craftsperson who can recognize the quality of their work without needing constant external confirmation. The individuated soul begins to develop an inner sense of rightness that operates independently of social approval. This is not arrogance, but competence, the natural result of learning to trust one's own deepest knowing. The withering of opinion often coincides with what the alchemists called the albedo, the whitening phase that follows the dissolution of the nigredo. Where once there was the black confusion of not knowing who one was without others' definitions, there now emerges a kind of clarity, a white light of self-recognition that illuminates the landscape of identity from within. This clarity is not harsh or judgmental, but gentle and revealing, like moonlight that shows the contours of the landscape, without the dramatic shadows cast by the sun of external attention. In this clarity, many things that once seemed vitally important begin to lose their urgency. The need to be liked by everyone reveals itself as both impossible and unnecessary. The desire to be understood by all reveals itself as a kind of spiritual materialism, an attempt to possess something that cannot be owned. The compulsion to explain oneself to every critic reveals itself as a form of energy leak that depletes the soul without producing any genuine resolution. What emerges in place of these exhausting pursuits is something far more sustainable. The simple authenticity of being who we are, regardless of the audience. This authenticity is not a performance or a stance, but a relaxation, a settling into the natural shape of one's being without the constant adjustments required by external reference points. It is like the difference between trying to walk while constantly checking mirrors to see how one appears to others, and simply walking with natural grace and presence. This shift often manifests in surprisingly practical ways. The closet full of clothes purchased to create certain impressions begins to feel less important than having a few items that feel genuinely comfortable and expressive. The social media presence crafted to generate likes and comments begins to feel less compelling than authentic self-expression, or perhaps no expression at all. The conversations filled with careful positioning and strategic self-presentation give way to the simple pleasure of honest exchange. But perhaps most significantly, the internal dialogue begins to change. The constant mental commentary about how others might be perceiving us, judging us, or evaluating our worth gradually quiets down. The elaborate scenarios of potential criticism and the defensive responses to imagined attacks begin to lose their compulsive power. In the space that opens up, we discover something that may have been there all along, but was drowned out by the noise of external reference. our own inner voice, our own knowing, our own sense of what is true and right and beautiful. Jung recognized this inner voice as the voice of the self, not speaking in the language of judgment or evaluation, but in the deeper tongue of wisdom and guidance. This voice does not tell us what others will think of our choices. It tells us what choices align with our deepest nature. It does not predict external outcomes. It reveals internal rightness. It does not promise approval. It offers something far more valuable: the recognition that we are already whole, already valuable, already worthy of love exactly as we are. The discovery of this inner authority often brings with it a sense of tremendous relief, as if a weight we did not know we were carrying has been lifted from our shoulders. The chronic tension of trying to please everyone relaxes into the more natural effort of being authentic with whoever is actually present. The exhausting work of maintaining multiple personas for different audiences gives way to the simplicity of showing up as ourselves in all circumstances. This does not mean becoming insensitive to context or ignoring the legitimate needs and boundaries of different relationships. Authenticity does not require us to behave identically in all situations or to share everything with everyone, but it does mean that the variations in our presentation arise from wisdom and appropriateness rather than from the compulsive need for approval. We learn to modulate our expression not because we are afraid of judgment, but because we have developed the capacity to sense what is most skillful and beneficial in each circumstance. The withering of opinion also creates space for a different quality of curiosity about others' perspectives. When we are not desperately seeking approval, we can actually be interested in what others think and feel without needing to agree with them or win them over. When we are not defending against criticism, we can explore whether there might be something valuable in challenging feedback without being devastated by it. When we are not performing for validation, we can engage in genuine dialogue rather than strategic conversation. This shift in the quality of our interactions often has a surprising effect on others. People who are accustomed to our people-pleasing behaviors may initially resist the change, may even escalate their attempts to elicit the old responses. But those who are capable of authentic relationship often find our new presence refreshing, even inspiring. They discover that they too can relax their own performative efforts when they are with someone who is not seeking their validation. Jung observed that individuation, while beginning as a personal process, inevitably serves the collective as well. The soul that has learned to find its own center becomes a kind of tuning fork for authenticity, helping others remember their own capacity for genuine self-expression. The person who no longer needs constant approval gives others permission to release their own approval-seeking behaviors. The consciousness that has found its own worth helps create a field in which others can discover their inherent value as well. This is the paradox of the withering of opinion. In becoming less concerned with what others think of us, we often become more genuinely helpful to them. In releasing our need for their validation, we create space for them to find their own. In stopping our performance for their benefit, we give them the gift of our authentic presence, which is far more nourishing than any carefully crafted image could ever be. The process is not always smooth or linear. There are moments when the old patterns reassert themselves, when the familiar anxiety about others' judgments returns with surprising intensity. There are relationships that cannot survive the transition. People who were only interested in the performing version of ourselves and have no patience for the authentic one. There are social situations that feel awkward or uncomfortable as we learn to navigate them without the familiar compass of approval seeking. But gradually, as the new patterns stabilize and the authentic self becomes more familiar territory, these challenges begin to feel less daunting. We discover that we can tolerate others' disapproval without being destroyed by it. We learn that we can disappoint people without betraying our own integrity. We find that we can be misunderstood without losing our own sense of clarity about who we are and what we stand for. In the deepest phases of this transformation, even the concept of opinion itself begins to lose its solid reality. We begin to recognize that what we call others' opinions about us are often just reflections of their own internal states, their own projections, their own unresolved material. The criticism that felt so devastating reveals itself as information about the critic's pain. The praise that felt so validating reveals itself as a reflection of the praiser's current needs and preferences. This recognition brings with it a profound compassion, both for ourselves and for others. We see how much suffering is generated by the collective agreement to take opinions as fundamental truth. We understand how much energy is wasted in the endless dance of seeking approval and avoiding criticism. We recognize how much authentic connection is lost in the performance of trying to be what we think others want us to be. And in this compassion, we find ourselves naturally offering to others what we have discovered for ourselves. The possibility of worth that is not contingent on external validation, the reality of value that does not depend on others' recognition, the truth of being that exists independent of any opinion whatsoever. The withering of opinion, in its completion, reveals itself to have been not a withering at all, but a blooming, the flowering of authentic selfhood that was always present, but obscured by the thick foliage of external reference. What seemed like loss was actually discovery. What felt like isolation was actually homecoming. What appeared to be the death of connection was actually the birth of the capacity for genuine relationship. For in the end, we discover that we cannot truly love others until we have learned to find our own worth independent of their approval. We cannot offer authentic presence until we have stopped performing for validation. We cannot create genuine intimacy until we have released the need for others to complete our sense of self. The voices of approval and criticism fade not because we have become deaf to them, but because we have learned to hear the deeper voice that speaks beneath all human judgment, the voice of being itself, which knows no comparison, requires no validation, and offers the only opinion that ultimately matters, that we are and that our being is inherently valuable, infinitely precious, and perfectly worthy of love exactly as we are. In the sacred laboratory of the human heart, where the raw materials of connection are slowly refined into their purest essence, there comes a moment of profound recognition that changes everything we thought we knew about love. The possessive threads that once bound us to those we cherish most, those silken cords of need, expectation, and emotional ownership that felt so much like love itself, begin their mysterious dissolution, revealing beneath them something so much more vast and free that our previous understanding seems like a child's drawing compared to the living masterpiece. This is perhaps the most delicate and easily misunderstood of all the soul's transformations, for it strikes at the very heart of what we have been taught to value most: our special relationships, our exclusive bonds, our cherished attachments to those who make life feel meaningful and safe. The ego, faced with the prospect of releasing its grip on loved ones, experiences what can only be called a kind of existential terror, for it mistakes this loosening for loss, this freedom for abandonment, this evolution for the death of love itself. Yet what is actually dying is not love, but the shadow that has been cast over love, the possessive, controlling, fear-based energy that seeks to bind the beloved to us, to make them responsible for our happiness, to extract from them the security and validation that can only truly come from within. Jung understood this transformation as the movement from what he called participation mystique, the unconscious identification with the other that creates the illusion of fusion, to genuine individuation within relationship, where two whole beings can meet in authentic encounter. The alchemists knew this process intimately, for they understood that true gold could only emerge from the careful separation and purification of elements that had been unconsciously merged. In the realm of human connection, this separation is not a severing but a clarification, not a breaking apart but a refining that allows each person to show up more fully as themselves, and therefore to offer something genuine to the dance of relationship. The possessive threads that begin to dissolve are often so subtle, so woven into the fabric of our daily interactions, that we hardly recognize them as constraints until they start to loosen. There is the thread of expectation, the largely unconscious assumption that the beloved should behave in certain ways, should meet certain needs, should provide certain emotional experiences on demand. There is the thread of ownership, the sense that this person belongs to us in some fundamental way, that their choices and actions reflect on us, that their independence somehow diminishes our security. There is the thread of completion fantasy, the belief that this other person can fill the empty places within us, can provide the missing pieces of our wholeness, can be the answer to our existential loneliness. And perhaps most challenging to release, there is the thread of identity fusion, the way we have made their love for us into a pillar of our self-worth, their presence in our lives into a cornerstone of our sense of meaning and purpose. These threads, when we first begin to see them clearly, can appear to be love itself. The intensity of our need can feel like the depth of our caring. The urgency of our attachment can seem like evidence of the relationship's importance. The pain we feel at any threat to the connection can appear to prove how much the other person means to us. But as consciousness begins to mature, as the soul starts to recognize its own wholeness, these patterns reveal themselves to be something quite different from love. They are love mixed with fear, connection contaminated by control, caring complicated by compulsion. The process of purification begins, as it always does, with recognition. Perhaps it starts with the uncomfortable realization that our happiness has become hostage to another person's mood, that our sense of well-being rises and falls with their attention and approval. Perhaps it begins with noticing how much energy we spend trying to manage their emotional state, trying to ensure they remain pleased with us, trying to prevent them from making choices that might disrupt our sense of security. Or perhaps it starts with the dawning recognition that beneath our declarations of love lies a deeper agenda, the unconscious demand that this person be who we need them to be, rather than who they actually are. We begin to see how much of what we called love was actually a form of sophisticated negotiation, an attempt to trade affection for security, intimacy for control, care for compliance with our emotional needs. This recognition often brings with it a period of profound disorientation, for if our deepest connections are revealed to contain these elements of unconscious manipulation, then what is real? If our most cherished relationships are built partly on mutual need rather than pure love, then where does genuine caring begin and neurotic attachment end? The soul, in its honesty, must face the possibility that much of what it called love was actually a more complex mixture of authentic affection and unconscious exploitation. Jung called this phase the confrontation with the shadow of relationship, the necessity of recognizing and integrating the darker aspects of our connection patterns before genuine love can emerge. This shadow includes not only our possessiveness and control, but also our tendency to use others as mirrors for our self-worth, our habit of making them responsible for our emotional state, our unconscious agreement to remain partially unconscious together rather than supporting each other's growth toward wholeness. The dissolution of these patterns does not happen quickly or easily, for they are often deeply rooted in our earliest experiences of attachment and care. The child who learned that love meant being needed develops an adult pattern of creating dependency in relationships. The child who experienced love as conditional on good behavior develops an adult pattern of trying to earn affection through performance. The child who lost important connections develops an adult pattern of clinging to relationships out of terror of abandonment. But as the soul begins to find its own center, as consciousness learns to rest in its own inherent wholeness, these ancient patterns start to lose their compulsive power. The need to be needed gives way to the simple pleasure of being appreciated. The compulsion to perform for love gives way to the freedom of being accepted as we are. The terror of abandonment gives way to the recognition that we are never actually alone, for we carry within us the very source of love itself. This transformation often manifests first as a kind of relaxation in our relationships. The chronic tension of trying to maintain the beloved's interest begins to ease. The constant vigilance for signs of threat to the connection starts to dissolve. The exhausting work of managing both our own and the other's emotional state gives way to a more natural responsiveness to what is actually present in each moment. As this relaxation deepens, something remarkable begins to emerge. The capacity to see the beloved as they actually are rather than as we need them to be. Free from the urgent agenda of getting our needs met, we can finally perceive them with the clarity that is love's true signature. We can appreciate their unique qualities without needing to possess them. We can support their growth without needing to direct it. We can enjoy their presence without clinging to it. This shift from possession to appreciation, from ownership to stewardship, from attachment to love, often feels paradoxical to the ego, for the ego believes that caring less about the outcome of the relationship means caring less about the person. It cannot initially comprehend that releasing our grip on the beloved might actually allow us to love them more fully, more freely, more genuinely than ever before. But this is precisely what Jung meant when he spoke of love as the recognition of the divine in the other. Not the divine as we imagine it should be, but the divine as it actually manifests through this unique person with their own path, their own lessons, their own destiny to fulfill. True love, he understood, does not seek to capture the divine, but to honor it, not to possess it, but to serve it, not to control its expression, but to create space for its authentic unfolding. The alchemical transformation of attachment into love often precipitates what appears to be a crisis in the relationship. The beloved, accustomed to our need-based attention, may feel neglected when we stop trying to manage their emotional state. They may interpret our new freedom as rejection, our lessened possessiveness as lack of caring. They may even escalate their own needy behaviors in an attempt to re-engage us in the familiar dance of mutual dependency. This phase requires tremendous patience and compassion, for we are essentially inviting the beloved into a completely different kind of relationship, one based on choice rather than compulsion, on authentic expression rather than strategic positioning, on mutual support for individuation rather than mutual agreement to remain unconscious. Not everyone is ready for this invitation. Some relationships cannot survive the transformation from attachment to love, for they were built primarily on the foundation of mutual need and cannot adapt to the new ground of mutual freedom. But for those relationships that can make this transition, something miraculous unfolds. The space that opens up when possessiveness dissolves becomes a sanctuary for authentic intimacy. The energy that was once spent managing and controlling becomes available for genuine presence and appreciation. The attention that was once scattered across multiple agendas of need and manipulation becomes available for the simple joy of witnessing and celebrating the beloved's unique expression of life. Jung observed that this transformation serves not only the individuals involved, but the larger evolution of consciousness itself. Relationships that have moved from attachment to love become laboratories for the development of capacities that the world desperately needs. To care without controlling, to support without interfering, to remain connected while honoring autonomy, to love without possessing. These capacities, once developed in intimate relationships, naturally extend into all other areas of connection. The parent who has learned to love without clinging can support their child's individuation without feeling abandoned. The friend who has discovered the difference between attachment and affection can offer support without creating dependency. The colleague who has learned to care without controlling can collaborate without competition. But perhaps most significantly, the soul that has learned to love others without possessing them discovers that it can also love itself without the cruel possession of self-judgment, self-manipulation, and self-rejection. The same controlling energy that we release in our relationships with others is the energy that keeps us trapped in patterns of internal criticism and self-improvement projects. Learning to love others freely teaches us to love ourselves freely as well. This internal shift often manifests as a profound relaxation in our relationship with ourselves. The constant monitoring of our own performance begins to ease. The harsh internal critic that once drove us to be worthy of love begins to quiet down. The exhausting project of trying to perfect ourselves in order to deserve affection gives way to the simple recognition that we are already lovable exactly as we are. As this self-acceptance deepens, it creates a kind of resonance field that naturally invites others into their own self-acceptance as well. People who spend time around someone who has learned to love without attachment often report feeling more free to be themselves, more accepted in their imperfections, more supported in their authentic expression. This is because genuine love, unlike attachment, is not conditional on the beloved being other than they are. The process of relationship alchemy continues to unfold in deeper and more subtle ways as consciousness matures. We begin to recognize that even our desire to help others, to fix their problems, to save them from their suffering, can contain elements of subtle control. We discover that our well-meaning advice and guidance can sometimes be unconscious attempts to make others conform to our vision of what would be best for them. Learning to distinguish between authentic support and subtle manipulation becomes an ongoing practice, a continuous refinement of our capacity to love purely. We learn to offer help without attachment to whether it is received. We learn to share wisdom without needing to be seen as wise. We learn to express care without requiring a specific response. We learn to be present without agenda. This purification of our loving extends even to our spiritual relationships, our connection to teachers, guides, and wisdom traditions. We begin to recognize the ways we may have sought to possess spiritual experiences, to own particular insights, to make even our connection to the divine into another form of special relationship that reinforces our ego rather than dissolving it. The mature soul learns to hold even its most sacred connections lightly, receiving guidance without grasping it, experiencing grace without trying to repeat it, touching the divine without trying to capture it. This lightness of touch allows the spiritual relationship to remain alive and dynamic rather than becoming another form of attachment that limits both growth and authentic expression. Jung understood that this evolution from attachment to love is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process of refinement that continues throughout life. Each relationship offers new opportunities to discover and release possessive patterns. Each connection presents fresh chances to practice loving without controlling, caring without clinging, supporting without interfering. The heart that has tasted this freedom finds that it can engage more fully in relationships, not less, free from the constant anxiety of maintaining and protecting attachments. It can be more present to what is actually happening between itself and others. Free from the need to extract security from connections, it can appreciate the simple gift of shared presence. Free from the compulsion to make others responsible for its happiness, it can offer its own joy as a contribution to the relationship rather than as a demand. This is the ultimate paradox of relationship alchemy, that in learning to love without attachment, we discover our capacity for deeper intimacy than we ever imagined possible. In releasing our possessive grip on others, we find ourselves able to receive them more fully. In stopping our attempts to control outcomes, we open to possibilities we never could have orchestrated. In learning to let go, we discover what it means to truly embrace. The possessive threads that once bound us to loved ones dissolve, not because love has died, but because love has finally been born. Love that is free from fear, connection that is rooted in choice rather than need, intimacy that enhances rather than diminishes the autonomy of both people involved. This is the gold that emerges from the alchemical fire of conscious relationship, the treasure that is discovered only when we have the courage to release everything we thought love required of us. In the end, we discover that what we always wanted from our relationships, to be seen, understood, appreciated, and loved, becomes naturally available when we learn to offer these same gifts without attachment to receiving them in return. The love we thought we needed to get from others was always the love we were capable of being. The connection we sought to create through possession was always available through presence. The security we tried to extract from attachment was always accessible through our own wholeness. And in this recognition, relationship is revealed as it truly is, not a prison of mutual need, but a dance of mutual freedom, not a contract of possession, but a celebration of authentic expression, not an attachment that binds, but a love that liberates both the lover and the beloved into the fullness of who they are meant to be. In the final movement of consciousness returning to itself, there comes a moment when the golden dreams we have projected onto future moments begin to lose their hypnotic power, like mirages that shimmer and dissolve as we approach them. The elaborate fantasies of someday, the perfect job, the ideal relationship, the final achievement that will complete us, the distant shore where all our current struggles will be resolved, gradually release their grip on our attention, revealing something so immediate, so present, so complete, that our previous fixation on what might come seems like the last vestige of a dream from which we are finally awakening. This dissolution of our investment in future fulfillment is perhaps the most profound liberation the soul can experience, for it represents the final collapse of time's tyranny over consciousness. The ego, in its restless seeking, has always lived in a state of temporal displacement, perpetually reaching toward tomorrow for what it believes is missing today, constantly deferring its contentment to some imagined moment when conditions will finally align according to its preferences. Jung understood this pattern as one of the ego's most persistent defenses against the direct encounter with reality. By projecting fulfillment into the future, consciousness avoids the vulnerability of receiving what is actually present. By investing in what might come, it protects itself from the intensity of what is actually here. By living in anticipation, it maintains the comfortable distance from immediate experience that keeps it feeling separate, seeking, and therefore safely in control. But as the process of individuation deepens, as the soul settles more fully into its own ground, this temporal displacement begins to feel increasingly artificial and exhausting. the constant mental rehearsal of future scenarios, the planning, strategizing, and anticipating that once felt so important gradually reveals itself as a kind of avoidance, a way of missing the only moment in which life is actually occurring. The death of future begins subtly, often with small moments of recognition that pierce through our chronic mental time travel. Perhaps it is the sudden awareness that we have been so focused on where we are going that we have missed the journey entirely. Perhaps it is the realization that many of our most cherished goals, when finally achieved, brought nothing like the satisfaction we had imagined. Perhaps it is the simple observation that our happiest moments have almost always been those when we were completely absorbed in what was happening right now, with no thought of what might come next. These recognitions accumulate like drops of water wearing away stone, gradually eroding the solid reality that future-focused thinking once possessed. We begin to see how much of our present moment experience has been filtered through the lens of its potential impact on our future plans. We start to notice how many of our current activities are performed not for their own sake, but as investments in some imagined tomorrow that may never arrive in the form we expect. The alchemists called this phase the dissolution of temporal gold, the recognition that what we thought was precious, our future dreams and plans, was actually base metal, preventing us from recognizing the true gold that is always available in the immediacy of now. This dissolution is not a loss, but a clarification, not a diminishment, but a concentration of attention into the only moment that actually exists. As this process deepens, we begin to experience what Jung called the eternal moment, the recognition that the present instant is not just a thin slice between past and future, but is actually the eternal ground from which all temporal experience emerges. The present moment reveals itself to be not moving but still, not temporal but timeless, not limited but infinite in its depth and richness. This recognition often precipitates a fundamental shift in how we approach planning and goal setting. We continue to make practical arrangements for anticipated needs, continue to engage in reasonable preparation for probable scenarios. But these activities are no longer driven by the anxious energy of trying to secure future happiness. They arise instead from a kind of present moment wisdom that naturally tends to what needs tending without emotional investment in outcomes. The plans we make become lighter, more flexible, more responsive to changing circumstances. Goals transform from desperate attempts to extract fulfillment from future achievements into organic expressions of present moment creativity and inspiration. Projects unfold not because we need them to succeed in order to be happy, but because they feel aligned with what wants to emerge through us right now. This shift often feels disorienting to those around us who are still caught in the future-focused paradigm. They may interpret our lessened investment in outcomes as lack of ambition or commitment. They may worry that without the driving force of future seeking, we will become passive or unmotivated. They may not understand that what has died is not our capacity for engagement, but only our neurotic attachment to future satisfaction. What they cannot see from the outside is that a different kind of motivation has emerged. Not the desperate push toward an imagined better tomorrow, but the natural pull of present moment aliveness, calling forth authentic expression. This motivation is more sustainable because it is not dependent on external circumstances. It is more creative because it is not constrained by predetermined outcomes. It is more joyful because it finds fulfillment in the process itself rather than deferring satisfaction to some distant goal. Jung observed that this transformation represents the ego's final surrender to the self, the recognition that the small, time-bound self cannot actually control or guarantee future satisfaction, and that true fulfillment is only available through alignment with the timeless self that exists in the eternal now. This surrender is not defeat, but victory, the triumph of presence over projection, of being over becoming, of depth over duration. The death of future often coincides with a profound shift in how we experience time itself. Linear time, the march of seconds, minutes, and hours towards some destination, begins to feel less solid and more relative. We discover moments of presence so complete that they seem to contain eternity, experiences so rich that they make the passage of clock time seem irrelevant. We touch what the mystics have always known, that time is not the master of consciousness, but rather one of consciousness's most malleable creations. In these moments of temporal transcendence, we glimpse what it means to live in what the Zen masters called beginner's mind, approaching each moment with the freshness of someone encountering it for the first time, free from the preconceptions and expectations that past experience and future projection tend to impose. Every conversation becomes new. Every sunrise becomes unprecedented. Every breath becomes the first breath of a being just born into existence. This freshness is not naivety, but rather the natural state of consciousness when it is not burdened by temporal displacement. Free from the weight of past regrets and future anxieties, awareness can meet each moment with its full presence, its complete attention, its undivided energy. This is the state in which genuine creativity arises, authentic relationship becomes possible, and the sacred dimension of ordinary experience reveals itself. The process is not without its challenges. The ego, faced with the dissolution of its temporal operating system, may initially panic at what feels like a loss of direction and purpose. If we are not moving toward some future goal, what gives our lives meaning? If we are not building toward some greater achievement, what makes our current activities worthwhile? If we are not improving ourselves for some imagined better version, what motivates growth and change? These questions reveal the depth of our conditioning around future-based thinking. They show how thoroughly we have been trained to find meaning in progression rather than presence, in becoming rather than being, in the promise of tomorrow rather than the gift of today. The soul that is releasing its investment in future fulfillment must learn to find meaning in a completely different way, not in where it is going, but in how fully it can show up to where it is. This shift in the source of meaning often precipitates what can only be called a spiritual awakening. For when we are no longer seeking satisfaction in some imagined future, we become available to recognize the satisfaction that is already present. When we are no longer waiting for conditions to improve, we become capable of appreciating the perfection that exists within current conditions. When we are no longer postponing our contentment, we discover that contentment is not something we achieve, but something we are. Jung called this recognition the realization of the self, not as something we become in the future through psychological development, but as what we already are beneath all our temporal seeking and striving. The self exists outside of time, complete in each moment, requiring nothing additional for its fulfillment. The recognition of the self is therefore always a present moment event, never something that can be postponed or achieved through future effort. This recognition transforms not only our relationship to time, but our relationship to all experience. Difficulties are no longer obstacles to be overcome on the way to some better future, but opportunities for present moment, deepening, and growth. Challenges are no longer problems to be solved, but invitations to discover our capacity for presence in the face of uncertainty. Even suffering is no longer something to be endured until it passes, but a teacher offering lessons that can only be learned right now. The death of future reveals that what we have been seeking through temporal displacement was always available in temporal presence. The peace we thought we would find when our circumstances finally aligned is accessible right now through acceptance of current circumstances. The joy we imagined would come with future achievements is available right now through appreciation of present gifts. The love we expected to receive from future relationships is flowing right now through our own heart's capacity for caring. This does not mean becoming passive or abandoning all forward-thinking activity. The consciousness that has found its center in the present moment naturally engages with practical planning, reasonable preparation, and skillful action toward beneficial outcomes. But these activities arise from presence rather than seeking, from wholeness rather than neediness, from inspiration rather than desperation. The mature soul learns to hold future possibilities lightly, like seeds that may or may not sprout, depending on conditions beyond our control. It tends these seeds with care and attention, but does not make its happiness dependent on their particular form of flowering. It plants gardens not because it needs the harvest to feel fulfilled, but because gardening is itself a joyful expression of present-moment creativity and care. This lightness extends to all future-oriented activities. Career goals become playful experiments rather than desperate necessities. Relationship hopes become gentle preferences rather than emotional demands. Health and wellness practices become expressions of present-moment self-care rather than insurance policies against future suffering. Creative projects become celebrations of current inspiration rather than investments in eventual recognition. In this lightness, we discover a kind of efficiency that was never available through future-focused striving. When we are not carrying the heavy burden of needing specific outcomes, we can respond more quickly and appropriately to what each situation actually requires. When we are not distracted by mental projections of what might happen, we can perceive more clearly what is happening. When we are not investing our energy in imaginary futures, we have more energy available for effective action in the present. Jung observed that this shift from future-seeking to present-moment engagement often coincides with a natural flowering of what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension without needing to resolve them into some future synthesis. We learn to be content with uncertainty without giving up on clarity. We learn to accept what is while remaining open to what might emerge. We learn to rest in not knowing while continuing to act from whatever wisdom is currently available. This capacity for holding paradox is itself a sign of spiritual maturation. The ego, in its need for temporal certainty, constantly tries to resolve the creative tension between being and becoming, between acceptance and aspiration, between presence and planning. But the individuated consciousness learns to inhabit this tension without collapse, finding in it a source of ongoing creativity and dynamic responsiveness to life's ever-changing demands. The death of future also transforms our relationship to memory and the past. When we are no longer using the past as evidence for what the future might bring, we can appreciate memory for what it actually is, a present moment arising of images, feelings, and associations that may inform our current understanding without determining our future possibilities. The past becomes a resource rather than a prison, a teacher rather than a tyrant, a gift rather than a burden. We discover that healing old wounds does not require changing what happened, but rather changing our present moment relationship to what happened. We learn that forgiveness is not something we do in order to create a better future, but something we are in this moment when we release our mental grip on past hurts. We find that wisdom gained from previous experiences is not a guarantee against future mistakes, but a present moment capacity for more skillful response to whatever arises. As the process deepens, even the distinction between present and future begins to dissolve. We recognize that what we call the future is always imagination happening now, and what we call the present is always unfolding into what was previously future. Time reveals itself to be not a linear progression, but a kind of eternal spiraling, always arriving at now from every possible direction. In this recognition, the death of future completes itself by revealing that there was never actually a future to die. There was only the present moment mistaking itself for something else, consciousness dreaming that it was separated from itself by temporal distance. The awakening from this dream is not dramatic but gentle, like opening our eyes to discover that what we thought was darkness was only our eyes being closed. The golden dreams we projected onto future moments dissolve not because they were false, but because they were unnecessary. Everything they promised, peace, joy, love, fulfillment, completion, is revealed to be already present, already accessible, already perfect in this very moment. The treasure we thought lay buried in some distant tomorrow is discovered to be the ground on which we have always been standing. And in this discovery, time transforms from master to servant, from prison to playground, from necessity to choice. We learn to dance with temporal experience without being enslaved by it, to engage with planning and goals without losing our center in presence, to honor the unfolding of events without sacrificing our rootedness in the eternal, now that is the source and destination of all unfolding. The death of future is revealed to be the birth of true immediacy, not the shallow immediacy of impulse and reaction, but the profound immediacy of consciousness, recognizing itself in each moment as complete, whole, and infinitely present. This is the final homecoming, the ultimate recognition that we have never actually been anywhere other than here, never actually been in any time other than now, never actually been anyone other than the aware presence in which all experience of time and place and identity arises and dissolves like waves in the ocean of being. In this recognition, the journey that seemed to take us through so many stages of development, so many phases of growth and change, is revealed to have been a journey from here to here, from now to now, from ourselves to ourselves. The future dies because presence is born, and presence, we finally understand, is not a moment in time, but the timeless ground from which all moments emerge, and to which they all return, eternally complete, infinitely perfect, always already home. In the depths of transformation, when the old self has been thoroughly composted and the new self has not yet fully emerged, there comes a peculiar state of being that the mystics have long recognized but rarely spoken of directly. It is a condition that appears to the untrained eye as emotional flatness, as a kind of spiritual numbness that might concern those who still measure aliveness by the intensity of their reactions. But this is not numbness at all. It is something far more profound, far more liberating than the ego mind can initially comprehend. This is the emergence of what the ancient traditions call sacred indifference, and it arrives like dawn breaking over a landscape that has known only the dramatic extremes of night and day. It is the middle way between the fevered attachments that once drove us and the cold detachment that we might have mistaken for wisdom. It is neither the passionate engagement of youth nor the bitter withdrawal of disappointment, but something altogether different, a way of being that participates fully while remaining fundamentally unshaken. The first whispers of this sacred indifference often come as a surprise, arriving in moments when we expect to feel the familiar surge of reaction to life's provocations. Success, which once lifted us into realms of euphoria, now registers as simply what happened. Failure, which once plunged us into depths of despair, becomes merely another movement in the vast symphony of experience. The praise that once fed our hungry egos flows past us like water, nourishing but not intoxicating. The blame that once devastated our sense of worth passes through us like wind through an open window, acknowledged but not absorbed. At first, this can be deeply disconcerting. The ego, accustomed to the familiar patterns of inflation and deflation, of riding high and sinking low, begins to panic at this apparent flatness. Where has my passion gone? It asks. Where is my fire, my intensity, my engagement with life? The ego interprets this newfound equanimity as a kind of death, and in a sense, it is right. Something is dying, the compulsive need to be thrown about by circumstances, the addiction to the drama of ups and downs, the unconscious identification with every passing weather pattern of emotion and experience. But what the ego experiences as death, the soul recognizes as birth. This is not the death of feeling, but the birth of freedom. This is not emotional numbness, but emotional maturity, like a mountain that remains unchanged. Whether storm clouds gather around its peak or sunshine bathes its slopes, consciousness begins to discover its own unchanging nature beneath the constantly shifting circumstances of life. This sacred indifference is not achieved through suppression or spiritual bypassing. It is not the result of building walls around the heart or numbing ourselves to life's natural rhythms. Instead, it emerges organically from the deep understanding that we are not the weather patterns of our experience, but the sky through which they pass. We are not the waves, but the ocean, not the thoughts, but the awareness in which thoughts arise and dissolve, not the emotions, but the spacious presence that can hold all emotions without being defined by any of them. In this state, we begin to witness the profound difference between involvement and entanglement. We can be fully involved in the dramas of life, the relationships, the work, the creative projects, the challenges and opportunities, without becoming entangled in them. Entanglement is what happens when we lose ourselves in the story, when we forget our deeper nature and become identified with our roles, our successes, our failures, our hopes and fears. Involvement, on the other hand, is conscious participation. It is engagement without attachment, investment without addiction, care without compulsion. This sacred indifference reveals itself in the most ordinary moments. Standing in line at the grocery store, we notice that the impatience that once would have risen automatically simply doesn't appear. The delay is simply delay, neither good nor bad, just what is happening now. Receiving news of a setback that would once have triggered hours or days of emotional turbulence, we find ourselves responding with a calm clarity that surprises everyone, including ourselves. The setback is registered, appropriate action is taken, but the internal weather remains undisturbed. It shows up in our relationships as well, sometimes in ways that can initially confuse those who have known us in our more reactive states. The partner who is trying to provoke a familiar argument finds themselves met with a presence that neither fights nor flees, but simply witnesses. The family member who pushes the old buttons discovers that the buttons no longer seem to be connected to anything. This is not coldness or withdrawal. Quite the opposite. It is a quality of presence that is actually more available, more genuinely responsive because it is not caught up in the automatic patterns of defense and reaction. The mystics speak of this state as being like a lotus flower that grows in muddy water but remains unstained by it. The mud is not rejected or avoided. It is the very ground from which the lotus emerges. Similarly, sacred indifference does not arise from rejecting the messy, complicated, often painful realities of human existence. It emerges from full engagement with these realities, from having walked through the fires of experience so completely that we discover our essential nature cannot be burned. This indifference is sacred precisely because it is not born of cynicism or disappointment. It does not arise from a hardened heart or a closed mind. Instead, it emerges from the deepest kind of love, love so vast and unconditional that it embraces all possibilities without needing any particular outcome. It is the love of the mother who loves her child, regardless of whether the child succeeds or fails, behaves well or poorly, fulfills her dreams, or chooses an entirely different path. In this state, we begin to understand what the Buddha meant when he spoke of the middle way between indulgence and aversion. This is not a lukewarm compromise between extremes, but a dynamic equilibrium that can respond appropriately to whatever arises without being thrown off balance. Like a skilled surfer who rides the waves without being overwhelmed by them, consciousness learns to dance with the forces of life while maintaining its own center of gravity. The weather metaphor becomes particularly rich when we explore this territory. Weather patterns are natural, inevitable, and temporary. A storm is not wrong. It serves important functions in the larger ecosystem. Sunshine is not better than rain. Each has its place and purpose. Similarly, the weather patterns of human experience, joy and sorrow, success and failure, connection and isolation, begin to be seen as equally natural and necessary aspects of the human condition. Sacred indifference allows us to appreciate the beauty of a thunderstorm without being terrified by the lightning. We can enjoy the warmth of sunshine without becoming addicted to perpetual summer. We can witness the cleansing nature of rain without resenting the clouds that brought it. In our inner weather, we learn to welcome the storms of grief that clear the air, the heat of anger that burns away what no longer serves, the gentle rain of melancholy that nourishes new growth. This transformation of our relationship to experience ripples out into every aspect of life. Work becomes less charged with desperate ambition or paralyzing fear of failure. Relationships become less burdened with the weight of our projections and expectations. Creative endeavors become expressions of joy rather than vehicles for validation. Even the inevitability of death begins to feel less like a threat and more like a natural part of the larger rhythm of existence. The ego's resistance to this sacred indifference often intensifies before it relaxes. There can be a period where the old self makes one last desperate attempt to re-establish its dominance, to convince us that we are becoming boring, unambitious, or emotionally dead. It may whisper that we are losing our edge, our passion, our humanity. It may point to others who seem more dramatically engaged with life and suggest that we are somehow failing to fully live. But gradually, as we settle into this new way of being, a different kind of aliveness reveals itself. It is not the manic aliveness of the ego rushing from one experience to another, trying to fill some fundamental emptiness. Instead, it is the quiet aliveness of deep contentment, the steady flame that burns without consuming itself, the river that flows powerfully without struggling against its banks. In relationships, this sacred indifference often manifests as an increased capacity for genuine intimacy. When we are no longer desperately needing others to validate us or frantically trying to control their responses to us, we become available for real connection. We can listen without immediately planning our response. We can love without keeping score. We can offer support without attachment to the outcome. We can receive criticism without collapsing and praise without inflating. This quality of presence often has a mysteriously healing effect on those around us. People find themselves naturally relaxing in our company, feeling somehow safer to be themselves. The absence of our own emotional reactivity creates a space where others can explore their own feelings without fear of triggering our defenses or becoming responsible for managing our responses. Sacred indifference also transforms our relationship to time. The desperate urgency that once drove us begins to dissolve. Deadlines are met and responsibilities fulfilled, but without the underlying current of anxiety that once accompanied these activities. We begin to operate from what the Taoists call Wu Wei, effortless action that flows from a deep alignment with the natural rhythms of existence. This doesn't mean we become passive or disengaged. If anything, our actions become more effective because they are not contaminated by the emotional turbulence that used to cloud our judgment and dissipate our energy. We can respond to genuine emergencies with appropriate intensity while remaining centered and clear. We can pursue important goals with dedication while holding the results lightly. The paradox of sacred indifference is that it often leads to greater effectiveness in the world, not less. When we are no longer driven by compulsion or paralyzed by fear, when we are no longer inflated by success or devastated by failure, we can engage with life from a place of authentic response rather than automatic reaction. Our actions become expressions of wisdom rather than symptoms of woundedness. As this sacred indifference deepens, we begin to recognize it as one of the great gifts of the spiritual path. It is not the end goal, but rather one of the natural fruits of the deep inner work we have been doing. It emerges organically from the integration of shadow material, the dissolution of false identifications, and the gradual expansion of consciousness beyond the narrow confines of the personal ego. This state reveals itself as a form of spiritual maturity that honors both the human and the divine dimensions of existence. We remain fully human, capable of feeling, caring, engaging, creating, while simultaneously touching something that transcends the human condition. We participate in the dance of life while remembering our nature as the eternal witness of all dances. In the end, sacred indifference is perhaps best understood as a return to our original nature, to the unconditioned awareness that existed before we learned to be thrown about by every wind of circumstance. It is not something we achieve, but something we remember, not something we create, but something we uncover, like archaeologists carefully brushing away the accumulated dust of centuries to reveal the timeless treasure that was always there. This is the middle way between extremes, not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived reality, a way of being that honors both attachment and detachment as necessary phases in the eternal rhythm of consciousness, exploring itself through form. It is the discovery that we can love completely without being destroyed by loss, engage fully without being enslaved by outcome, care deeply without being crushed by the weight of caring. Sacred indifference emerges as the natural response of a consciousness that has found its home in the unchanging ground of being, while never losing its appreciation for the beautiful, terrible, magnificent play of existence that unfolds upon that ground. It is the peace that passes understanding, manifesting not as withdrawal from life, but as the deepest possible engagement with the mystery of being alive. Like a cosmic revelation whispered in the silence between heartbeats, there comes a moment in the journey of awakening when the entire edifice of seriousness that we have constructed around existence begins to shimmer and dissolve, revealing something so fundamentally joyous, so essentially playful, that it can only be described as the universe laughing at its own magnificent joke. This is the emergence of what we might call the lightness of being, not the shallow lightness of denial or spiritual bypassing, but the profound lightness that comes from recognizing the ultimately playful nature of all existence. This recognition often arrives like a gentle earthquake, shifting the very foundations of how we perceive reality. The dramas that once seemed so weighty and consequential, the career struggles, the relationship conflicts, the existential crises that kept us awake at night, suddenly reveal themselves as elaborate theatrical productions in which consciousness has been playing all the roles, directing all the scenes, and providing all the costumes for an eternal performance that has no audience other than itself. It is as if we have been living inside a vast cosmic theater, taking our assigned roles with deadly seriousness, memorizing our lines with desperate intensity, believing that the success or failure of the entire production depends upon our perfect performance. And then, in a moment of unprecedented clarity, we glimpse behind the stage and discover that there is no director demanding perfection, no critic waiting to judge our performance, no final curtain that will determine our ultimate worth. There is only consciousness, playing dress-up with itself, trying on different costumes and personas, for the sheer delight of experiencing what it might be like to be this character or that run. This revelation does not diminish the beauty or significance of the play, quite the opposite. When an actor fully embraces the playful nature of theater, when they stop worrying about whether they are good enough and start enjoying the creative expression itself, their performance often becomes more authentic, more compelling, more alive. Similarly, when we recognize the essentially playful nature of existence, our engagement with life often becomes more vibrant, more creative, more spontaneous than it ever was when we were caught in the grip of taking everything so seriously. The ego, of course, initially resists this recognition with considerable force. It has invested tremendous energy in maintaining the illusion that life is a serious business requiring constant vigilance, careful planning, and strategic maneuvering. The ego's very survival seems to depend upon the maintenance of drama, conflict, and urgent necessity. When the cosmic joke begins to become visible, the ego may interpret this as a threat to its existence, a dismissal of all its hard work and careful orchestration. But what the ego experiences as threat, the soul recognizes as liberation. This is not the cruel joke of cosmic indifference, but the loving joke of cosmic abundance, the recognition that consciousness has been playing all these roles, not out of some grim necessity, but out of pure creative joy. We are not trapped in a meaningless existence, but participating in a meaningful play, not victims of random circumstances, but co-creators in an improvisational masterpiece that has been unfolding since time began. This shift in perception transforms everything while changing nothing. The same relationships continue, the same responsibilities remain, the same challenges present themselves. But the quality of our engagement with all of these undergoes a fundamental transformation. Where once there was striving, there is now dancing. Where once there was anxiety about outcomes, there is now curiosity about what might emerge. Where once there was the heavy burden of trying to control the uncontrollable, there is now the light joy of surfing whatever waves consciousness chooses to generate. The metaphor of play reveals itself as more than mere metaphor. It becomes a direct recognition of the essential nature of existence itself. Children at play do not engage in their games because they have to, but because they want to. They do not play to achieve some external goal, but for the pure joy of the activity itself. They can become completely absorbed in their play while simultaneously knowing that it is play, taking it seriously without taking it too seriously. This is the quality of engagement that begins to characterize our interaction with life when the lightness of being emerges. We can become completely absorbed in our work while knowing that it is, in the deepest sense, play. We can invest ourselves fully in our relationships while recognizing them as beautiful forms of cosmic collaboration. We can pursue our goals with dedication while holding them as expressions of creativity rather than desperate attempts to prove our worth. The lightness that emerges is not superficial but profound. Not the lightness of avoiding depth, but the lightness that comes from touching something so deep that it reveals the arbitrary nature of all surface appearances. It is like discovering that the mountain you have been climbing with such effort is actually floating in space, held up not by solid rock, but by the same mysterious force that allows birds to fly and planets to orbit their stars. This recognition often manifests as spontaneous laughter, not the bitter laughter of cynicism, but the innocent laughter of delight. We might find ourselves laughing at the elaborate strategies we once employed to be happy, the complex philosophies we constructed to make sense of existence, the desperate seeking that never quite found what it was looking for because it was always already present. We laugh not because these efforts were wrong, but because they were like someone frantically searching for their glasses while wearing them. The cosmic joke, when it finally becomes visible, is not at our expense, but includes us in its humor. We are not the victims of existence's sense of humor, but its willing participants, not the objects of cosmic comedy, but its co-creators. The joke is not that life is meaningless, but that it is so meaningful that it can afford to be playful, so secure in its essential nature that it can experiment with endless variations and possibilities without ever losing itself. This lightness begins to infuse every aspect of experience. Conversations become less about proving points and more about exploring possibilities. Work becomes less about climbing ladders and more about expressing creativity. Relationships become less about fulfilling needs and more about sharing joy. Even challenges and difficulties begin to be approached with a kind of playful curiosity, not because we don't take them seriously, but because we recognize them as interesting puzzles rather than threats to our existence. The transformation is particularly noticeable in how we relate to our own thoughts and emotions. The inner drama that once seemed so compelling, the endless commentary, analysis, and judgment that constituted so much of our mental activity begins to reveal itself as a kind of internal theater in which consciousness has been playing all the parts. The critic, the victim, the hero, the sage, all of these internal characters begin to be seen as roles we have been playing rather than fundamental aspects of our identity. This recognition allows for a completely different relationship with our inner life. Instead of being dragged along by every thought and emotion, we begin to witness them with the same amused detachment that we might watch a puppet show or a sitcom. We can appreciate the creativity involved in the production, enjoy the performances, even be moved by the storylines, while never forgetting that it is all elaborate play. The lightness extends to our relationship with spiritual seeking itself. The desperate hunger for enlightenment, the complicated practices and sophisticated teachings, the endless workshops and retreats, all of these can be engaged with joy rather than compulsion, as expressions of play rather than symptoms of inadequacy. We might continue to meditate, read spiritual texts, and engage in conscious practices, but from a spirit of exploration and creativity rather than from a sense of urgent necessity. This does not lead to spiritual laziness, but to spiritual freedom. When we are no longer driven by the fear that we are somehow broken or incomplete, we can engage with spiritual practices from genuine interest and love. When we are no longer trying to achieve some future state of perfection, we can be present with what is actually here. When we are no longer taking our spiritual identity so seriously, we can actually embody the lightness and joy that authentic spirituality is meant to reveal. The playful quality that emerges is not frivolous but sacred. It is the play of children who are completely absorbed in their game, the play of artists who are lost in their creation, the play of lovers who have forgotten everything except the joy of being together. It is the play of consciousness, exploring its own infinite creativity, delighting in its capacity to manifest in countless forms while never losing its essential nature. This sacred play often manifests as increased spontaneity and creativity. The rigid patterns that once governed our behavior begin to loosen. We might find ourselves saying yes to opportunities that the old, serious self would have carefully analyzed and probably rejected. We might discover interests and talents that we never knew existed. We might begin to approach familiar situations from completely new angles, simply because it seems more interesting to do so. The lightness also affects our relationship with time. The desperate urgency that once drove us begins to dissolve. We can still meet deadlines and fulfill responsibilities, but without the underlying current of anxiety that once accompanied these activities. Time begins to feel more elastic, more spacious. We might spend hours engaged in an activity that brings us joy without feeling guilty about being unproductive. We might dawdle and meander through our days with the unhurried pace of someone who has finally realized that there is nowhere to go and nothing to achieve that is more important than the simple joy of being alive. This transformation often puzzles those around us who are still caught in the serious business of existence. They might interpret our lightness as irresponsibility or our playfulness as lack of ambition. They might worry that we are not taking life seriously enough, not striving hard enough, not worried enough about the future. But gradually, they often begin to notice that our supposed irresponsibility seems to generate more authentic results than their careful planning, that our playfulness produces more genuine solutions than their serious analysis, that our apparent lack of ambition somehow leads to more satisfying achievements. The cosmic joke, when fully appreciated, reveals itself as the deepest possible teaching about the nature of existence. It shows us that reality is not a problem to be solved, but a dance to be danced, not a mountain to be conquered, but a song to be sung. It reveals that we are not separate from the universe trying to figure it out, but expressions of the universe trying to experience itself from countless different perspectives. This recognition transforms suffering itself. Pain may still arise, physical discomfort, emotional turbulence, mental confusion, but it is held within a larger context of play. It becomes another movement in the dance, another color on the palette, another instrument in the orchestra. We can fully experience pain without being destroyed by it, because we recognize it as part of the play, rather than as evidence that something has gone fundamentally wrong. The lightness of being is ultimately the recognition that existence itself is an expression of love so vast and unconditional that it can afford to be playful. The universe is not struggling to survive or striving to achieve some distant goal. It is celebrating its own creativity, delighting in its infinite capacity for variation and surprise. We are not burdens that existence must carry, but expressions of its joy, not problems that need to be solved, but poems that consciousness is writing and rewriting in endless variation. When this recognition finally settles in, when it moves from intellectual understanding to lived reality, life becomes what it always was, but we had forgotten, a dance of pure creativity, a celebration of infinite possibility, a cosmic game of hide and seek in which consciousness is both the one hiding and the one seeking, both the player and the played, both the joke and the one laughing at the joke. This is the lightness of being, not escape from the human condition, but the recognition of its ultimate playfulness, not avoidance of responsibility, but the discovery that the highest responsibility is to participate joyfully in the cosmic dance, not the absence of meaning, but the presence of such profound meaning that it can afford to be lighthearted about itself. In the end, we discover that enlightenment might simply be remembering how to play, how to engage fully with the magnificent game of existence, while never forgetting that it is, in the deepest and most sacred sense, all just consciousness playing dress-up with itself for the sheer joy of seeing what it might become. In the deepening silence of transformation, as the familiar structures of identity continue their gentle dissolution, there emerges a pull so subtle yet so compelling that it seems to come from the very marrow of existence itself. It is not the desperate hunger of the ego seeking fulfillment, nor the restless wandering of a mind searching for answers, but something far more fundamental, a gravitational force that draws consciousness back toward its source, like rivers inevitably flowing toward the sea, like moths mysteriously called to dance with flame. This is the call of silence, the irresistible attraction to the void that birthed all form and to which all form must eventually return. It manifests not as depression or withdrawal from life, but as an inexplicable magnetism toward emptiness, toward the spaces between thoughts, toward the pregnant pause between heartbeats, where something vast and nameless seems to be waiting. Those who have never touched this mystery might interpret such attraction as morbid or escapist, but for the soul in the process of awakening, it feels like the most natural thing in the world, coming home to what we have always been, beneath all the elaborate costumes of personality and circumstance. The void that calls to us is not the emptiness of absence, but the emptiness of infinite potential. It is what the mystics have pointed toward with words like sunyata, the pregnant void from which all manifestation emerges and into which it dissolves, only to emerge again in endless cycles of creation and dissolution. Jung recognized this pull as the gravitational force of what he called the collective unconscious, that vast primordial substrate of consciousness from which individual awareness arises like waves from an ocean, maintaining their apparent separateness for a time, before inevitably returning to the source that gave them birth. This attraction to emptiness often begins to manifest in the most ordinary moments of daily life. We might find ourselves drawn to sit in empty rooms, to walk in places where there are no crowds, to seek out the quiet corners of existence where the noise of the world grows thin and something deeper becomes audible. Libraries, empty churches, deserted beaches, mountain peaks shrouded in mist. These places begin to call to us with an almost magnetic force, not because we are avoiding life, but because we are being drawn toward the source from which all life springs. The pull toward silence becomes particularly noticeable in our relationship with solitude, where once we might have filled every empty moment with activity, conversation, or distraction, we now find ourselves craving periods of aloneness that are not about escaping from others, but about meeting something that can only be encountered in the absence of external stimulation. This is not the loneliness of isolation, but the fullness of being alone, with the mystery of existence itself. In these moments of chosen solitude, something profound begins to reveal itself. The chattering mind, deprived of its usual external fodder, begins to quiet down. The constant stream of commentary, analysis, and judgment that has provided the soundtrack to our existence starts to fade into background silence, and in that silence we begin to detect the presence of something that has always been there, but was previously obscured by the noise of our thinking, a vast, spacious awareness that seems to extend infinitely in all directions. This awareness is not empty in the sense of being vacant or devoid of content. Rather, it is empty in the way that space itself is empty, not containing objects but providing the very ground in which all objects can appear and disappear. It is the silence from which all sounds emerge and to which they return, the darkness from which all light is born, the stillness from which all movement arises. The attraction to this void often intensifies during periods of transition and transformation. As old identities dissolve and new ones have not yet crystallized, we find ourselves suspended in a kind of existential between space that can feel both terrifying and deeply restful. The ego, accustomed to the solid ground of fixed identity, may experience this void as a threat to its existence, but the deeper self recognizes it as home, the original condition from which all experience emerges and to which it naturally returns. This pull toward emptiness begins to influence our choices in subtle but significant ways. We might find ourselves drawn to meditation not as a practice to achieve something, but as a way of consciously entering the void, of deliberately returning to the source. We might discover an increased appreciation for minimalism, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a recognition that less truly is more when more means more space, for the essential to reveal itself. Our relationships with others also begin to be touched by this attraction to emptiness. We find ourselves more comfortable with silence in conversations, less compelled to fill every pause with words. We become more appreciative of the spaces between words, recognizing that sometimes the most profound communication happens in what is not said. We begin to value presence over presentation, being over doing, the quality of silence that two people can share over the content of what they might discuss. The call of the void manifests differently for different people. For some, it shows up as an increased desire to spend time in nature, particularly in landscapes that evoke a sense of vastness, deserts, oceans, mountain ranges, or star-filled skies. These environments seem to mirror the inner landscape of consciousness itself, vast and open and essentially empty, yet somehow more alive and present than any busy, cluttered space. For others, the attraction to emptiness manifests as a growing appreciation for the gaps and pauses in daily life. The moment of silence before answering the phone, the pause between thoughts during meditation, the space of awareness that exists between sleeping and waking, these liminal moments begin to feel like doorways into something infinite and profound. Art and music also begin to be appreciated differently. We find ourselves drawn to works that emphasize space, silence, and simplicity rather than complexity and ornamentation. The paintings that move us most deeply might be those with vast expanses of empty canvas, or musical compositions that make masterful use of silence and pause. We begin to understand that the most powerful art often points not to what is present, but to what is absent, not to form, but to the formless ground from which all forms emerge. The void that calls to us is not static, but dynamic, not dead, but vibrantly alive with potential. It is like the silence between notes that gives music its rhythm and meaning, or the empty space in a painting that allows the painted forms to have significance. Without this emptiness, form would have no place to exist. Without this silence, sound would have no medium through which to travel. Without this darkness, light would have no contrast to give it definition. As we begin to respond to this call, to consciously enter into relationship with emptiness, something remarkable begins to happen. Instead of feeling diminished or reduced by the experience of void, we find ourselves expanded and enriched. The space of empty awareness turns out to be not a vacuum, but a plenum. Not the absence of everything, but the presence of pure potentiality itself. This recognition gradually dissolves one of the ego's deepest fears, the fear of annihilation. We begin to understand that what we have taken to be our individual self is not something that can be destroyed by contact with emptiness, but rather something that emerges from emptiness and is sustained by it at every moment. We are not separate from the void, but expressions of it, not threatened by emptiness, but birthed from it continuously. The attraction to silence and emptiness also begins to transform our understanding of death. What once appeared as the ultimate threat, the final emptiness that would end our existence, begins to reveal itself as perhaps the ultimate return, the final coming home to the source from which we never actually departed. Death begins to feel less like an enemy to be feared, and more like a friend who has been patiently waiting to show us something we have forgotten about our own nature. This shift in perception often brings with it a profound peace about mortality, not the peace of resignation or the false comfort of denial, but the peace that comes from recognizing that what we most essentially are cannot be destroyed because it was never born in the first place. We begin to understand that we are not temporary forms struggling to maintain our existence in a hostile universe, but rather expressions of the eternal emptiness that is the ground of all being. The call of the void also transforms our relationship with the present moment. Instead of trying to fill each moment with activity and achievement, we begin to appreciate the inherent fullness of simply being present to what is. We discover that the present moment, when fully entered, reveals itself to be not a thin slice of time sandwiched between past and future, but an opening into the timeless dimension of existence itself. This attraction to emptiness is not a rejection of form or manifestation. Rather, it is a recognition of the intimate relationship between form and emptiness, a understanding that they are not opposites but dance partners in the eternal choreography of consciousness. The empty space doesn't negate the sculpture. It allows the sculpture to exist. The silence doesn't destroy the music. It gives the music its rhythm and meaning. As we learn to consciously enter the void, to rest in emptiness without fear, we begin to discover that this space is not dead or inert, but vibrantly alive with creative potential. It is the womb of consciousness, the matrix from which all thoughts, feelings, experiences, and identities emerge. By learning to be comfortable in this space, we begin to touch the source of our own creativity, the wellspring from which our most authentic expressions flow. The practical effects of responding to this call are often surprising. Instead of becoming withdrawn or passive, we might find ourselves more spontaneously creative, more genuinely responsive to life's invitations. Having touched the source of all possibilities, we become more available to the specific possibilities that are calling for expression through us. Having rested in the void, we return to form with renewed appreciation for its beauty and temporary nature. This is the profound paradox of the spiritual journey, that by embracing emptiness we become more full, by accepting the void we become more alive, by surrendering to silence we find our authentic voice. The moth that is drawn to the flame is not seeking destruction but illumination, not death but transformation. Similarly, consciousness that is drawn to the void is not seeking annihilation but recognition, not the end of existence but the discovery of what existence actually is. In the end, the call of silence, the attraction to the void, reveals itself as consciousness returning to its own source, like a prodigal child who has wandered far from home and suddenly hears the familiar voice of the mother calling them back. It is not escape from life, but the deepest possible engagement with the mystery from which all life emerges. It is not withdrawal from love, but the recognition that love itself is born from and sustained by the infinite emptiness that is the heart of all that is. This void, this silence, this pregnant emptiness that calls to us so mysteriously is revealed in the end to be not other than our own deepest nature, not something we approach from the outside, but something we discover we have never actually left, not a destination we seek, but the ground on which we have always been standing, waiting only for the noise to quiet down enough for us to notice what has been here all along. In the culminating recognition of this profound journey through the landscapes of consciousness, we arrive at perhaps the most paradoxical and liberating understanding of all, that attachment and detachment are not opposing forces locked in eternal combat, but dance partners in the cosmic choreography of awakening. Like the inhalation and exhalation that sustain physical life, consciousness naturally moves between engagement and release, between holding and letting go in a rhythm so fundamental that it underlies the very fabric of existence itself. This is the eternal return, not in Nietzsche's sense of infinite repetition, but in the deeper sense of consciousness returning again and again to its own essential nature, while never abandoning its love affair with form and manifestation. It is the recognition that the spiritual path does not lead away from the world, but through it and back to it, transformed by the journey but never separate from what it has always been, the one appearing as the many, the formless dancing as form, the eternal expressing itself through the temporal without ever losing its timeless nature. The mature soul comes to understand that detachment is not the opposite of attachment, but its perfected expression. True detachment is not the cold withdrawal of a heart that has been wounded too often, nor the spiritual bypassing of one who refuses to engage with the messiness of human existence. Rather, it is the warm spaciousness of a consciousness that can embrace everything without being consumed by anything, that can love deeply without losing itself in love, that can engage fully without becoming enslaved to outcomes. This understanding emerges gradually, often after years or decades of oscillating between the extremes, periods of passionate attachment, followed by periods of rigid detachment, times of deep involvement, followed by times of complete withdrawal. The soul learns through experience that neither extreme provides the freedom it seeks. Attachment without the capacity for detachment becomes addiction, possession, the desperate clinging that transforms love into suffering. Detachment without the capacity for attachment becomes coldness, isolation, the spiritual pride that masquerades as wisdom but is really just another form of fear. The sacred dance between these apparent opposites reveals itself most clearly in the realm of relationships. The awakening consciousness learns to love with what we might call non-attached attachment, the capacity to care deeply while holding lightly, to invest fully while remaining free, to open the heart completely while keeping the hands relaxed. This is not the love of need, but the love of abundance. Not the love that seeks to possess, but the love that delights in giving. Not the love that fears loss, but the love that celebrates the privilege of having been able to love at all. In this mature form of love, we can hold our beloveds, whether partners, children, friends, or causes, with the tenderness of a mother bird protecting her young and the openness of a gardener who knows that holding too tightly will crush what she seeks to nurture. We learn to be fully present to those we love without making them responsible for our happiness, to offer ourselves completely without losing ourselves in the offering, to create intimate bonds without constructing cages. This dance reveals itself in the breath itself, that most fundamental rhythm of embodied existence. Each inhalation is an act of attachment, drawing the world into ourselves, embracing life, saying yes to existence. Each exhalation is an act of detachment, releasing, letting go, trusting the void to hold us until the next breath arises naturally. We do not force the breath, nor do we resist it. We simply allow the natural rhythm to flow through us, recognizing that trying to hold on to the inhalation would kill us just as surely as refusing to inhale again would end our lives. The same rhythm that governs breath governs all of life. There are seasons for gathering and seasons for releasing, times for building and times for letting go, periods of expansion and periods of contraction. The mature soul learns to honor both movements without trying to force either one, to embrace the fullness when it comes without grasping at it, to accept the emptiness when it arrives without fleeing from it. This wisdom transforms our relationship with success and failure, gain and loss, praise and blame. We can celebrate success fully without becoming attached to being successful, enjoy abundance deeply without becoming dependent on having abundance, receive praise graciously without becoming addicted to being praised. Similarly, we can experience failure without becoming identified with being a failure, endure loss without losing ourselves in the losing, accept criticism without collapsing into self-hatred or defending with aggression. The eternal return reveals itself as the rhythm by which consciousness explores its own infinite nature through the vehicle of finite experience. Each attachment is consciousness, diving deeply into a particular form of experience, falling in love, pursuing a creative project, dedicating oneself to a cause, becoming absorbed in the beauty of a sunset or the mystery of a child's laughter. Each detachment is consciousness returning to its own essential nature, resting in the space of pure awareness before the next wave of engagement arises. This understanding gradually dissolves the spiritual seeker's common confusion about whether they should be more attached or more detached, whether they should engage more fully with life or cultivate more equanimity about outcomes. The question itself is revealed as based on a false dichotomy. The mature soul does both and neither, engaging fully while remaining free, caring deeply while holding lightly, participating completely while remembering its essential nature as the unchanging witness of all participation. In the realm of work and creative expression, this sacred dance manifests as the ability to pour ourselves completely into our projects and endeavors while remaining unattached to whether they succeed or fail according to external measures. We can write the book, create the art, build the business, serve the cause with total dedication while holding the results lightly, trusting that our wholehearted engagement is valuable regardless of how the world receives it. This transforms work from a means to an end into an end in itself, from a way of trying to prove our worth into an expression of our inherent worthiness. We no longer create in order to become someone, but because we already are someone. No longer strive in order to arrive somewhere, but because we have realized we are already here. No longer seek validation through achievement, but offer our achievements as expressions of gratitude for the privilege of being alive and creative. The same principle applies to our spiritual practice and growth. We can dedicate ourselves to meditation, study, service, and self-inquiry with complete commitment while remaining unattached to becoming enlightened, reaching some final state of completion, or being seen as spiritual by others. The practice itself becomes the path. The journey becomes the destination. The seeking becomes the finding. This releases us from the exhausting project of spiritual perfectionism, the grim determination to eradicate all traces of ego, emotion, and human messiness from our experience. We can embrace our humanity completely while simultaneously touching what transcends humanity, embody our personalities fully while remembering our nature as pure consciousness, engage in the human drama wholeheartedly while never forgetting that it is, in the deepest sense, divine play. The eternal return also manifests in our relationship with thoughts and emotions. Instead of either getting caught in the content of our mental and emotional states or trying to remain constantly detached from them, we learn to dance with them, fully experiencing what arises while never losing our footing in the awareness that experiences all experiences. Anger can be felt completely without becoming an angry person. Sadness can be embraced fully without becoming identified as someone who is sad. Joy can be celebrated totally without becoming addicted to being joyful. This creates a quality of emotional authenticity that is both fully human and completely free. We are not suppressing our emotional nature in the name of spiritual transcendence, nor are we being overwhelmed by our emotions in the name of authentic expression. Instead, we are allowing the full spectrum of human feeling to flow through us like weather patterns moving through an open sky, acknowledged, experienced, and released without resistance or grasping. The dance between attachment and detachment reveals itself most profoundly in our relationship with life and death, being and non-being, existence and void. We can embrace life fully, its beauty, its relationships, its experiences, its creative possibilities, while simultaneously being at peace with the inevitability of death, loss, and impermanence. We can love our existence completely while being willing to let it go when the time comes, not from resignation, but from the recognition that what we most essentially are cannot be destroyed by the dissolution of any particular form it happens to be expressing through. This understanding transforms grief from the desperate clinging of attachment into the sacred honoring of what has been loved and lost. We can mourn fully without being destroyed by mourning, feel the pain of separation completely without being separated from our essential nature by the pain. Grief becomes not the opposite of gratitude, but its deepest expression, the acknowledgement that something so beautiful was given to us that its absence creates a corresponding beauty of longing and remembrance. The mature soul learns to grieve like a master musician who can play both the major and minor keys with equal skill, who understands that the minor chords do not represent failure or mistake but are necessary for the full range of musical expression. The sadness of loss and the joy of having loved are revealed as complementary notes in the symphony of human experience, both necessary for the complete song. This sacred dance also governs our relationship with the different phases and seasons of life. We can embrace youth with its passion and intensity while being willing to release it when maturity calls. We can enjoy the strength and vigor of the middle years while gracefully accepting the wisdom and contemplation of age. We can live fully while dying gracefully, engage completely while letting go completely, saying yes to what is while remaining open to what might be. The eternal return reveals itself as the fundamental rhythm of consciousness itself, not going anywhere because it is already everywhere, not seeking anything because it already is everything, not becoming anything because it has never been anything other than what it eternally is. Yet this eternal, unchanging nature expresses itself through endless cycles of manifestation and dissolution, creation and destruction, engagement and release. In this recognition, the spiritual path reveals its ultimate secret. There is nowhere to go because we are already here, nothing to achieve because we already are what we seek, no one to become because we have never been anyone other than the one appearing as everyone. Yet this recognition does not end the path but transforms it, does not stop the dance but changes its quality from desperate seeking to joyful expression, from grim determination to playful exploration. The awakened life is revealed as the life that can fully embrace both the relative and absolute dimensions of existence, completely human while never forgetting its divine nature, totally engaged with the world, while never losing its connection to what transcends all worlds, deeply attached to the forms that consciousness takes, while never forgetting that it is the formless awareness in which all forms appear and disappear. This is spiritual maturity, not the achievement of some final state, but the recognition of what has always already been present, not the arrival at some distant destination, but the appreciation of where we have always been standing, not the accomplishment of perfect detachment, but the embodiment of perfect freedom, which includes the freedom to attach and detach as love and wisdom dictate. In the end, the eternal return reveals itself as love's own rhythm, the love that can embrace all possibilities because it is attached to none, the love that can engage with all forms because it is not limited by any, the love that can dance with attachment and detachment because it recognizes them both as expressions of its own infinite creativity. This is the love that is consciousness itself, exploring its own nature through the endless dance of form and formlessness, attachment and release, engagement and transcendence. We discover that we are not separate beings trying to find our way back to unity, but expressions of unity, exploring what it might be like to appear as separate beings. We are not lost souls seeking to return home, but home itself, endlessly creating new ways to experience the joy of coming home to what we have never actually left. The eternal return is revealed as the cosmic dance in which consciousness celebrates its own nature by temporarily forgetting and then remembering what it has always been. Pure love dancing as infinite possibility, eternal being expressing itself as endless becoming, the one appearing as the many while never losing its essential unity. This is the culmination of the spiritual journey, not an ending, but a new beginning, not an arrival, but a deeper departure, not the cessation of the dance, but its most graceful and liberated expression. We learn to live completely in the world while belonging ultimately to the mystery that transcends all worlds, to participate fully in the human drama while never forgetting our nature as the divine awareness in which all dramas appear and disappear like passing clouds in the infinite sky of consciousness.